Hello, sleepyheads. Tonight we're lighting a small candle and opening a very old cabinet of ideas. For centuries, physicians and preachers reached for the same label whenever a woman fainted, couldn't sleep, felt her chest tighten, lost her voice, wept for no reason, or simply didn't behave as expected: hysteria. It sounded tidy. It sounded learned. And it was used for almost anything. In the glow of monasteries and market squares, with quills scratching and bells tolling, a theory took hold. The female body was changeable, vaporous, ruled by wandering organs and wandering moods. If the diagnosis fit, society didn't have to ask difficult questions about grief, exhaustion, poverty, violence, or power. In this cozy deep dive, we'll wander those corridors carefully. We'll peek into the university lecture halls where Latin footnotes became life rules, the parish confessionals where symptoms became sins, and the kitchens where midwives and wise women tried to soothe suffering with warmth and herbs. You'll hear why uterine suffocation was the catch-all of the age, how perfumes, purges and marriages were prescribed as medicine, and how mystic visions could be praised one day and pathologized the next. Most of all, we'll look for the women themselves, between the lines, asking what their bodies were trying to say in a world that often refused to listen. If you love soft, thoughtful history told at a human pace, please consider subscribing. It helps this little candle burn longer. And because this is a cozy corner of the internet, tell me your snack situation tonight. Tea and biscuits, chocolate and strawberries, and where you're watching from. I read every comment and I'd love to map our small, kind community across the world. Ready? Pull your blanket a little tighter. Let's open the cabinet and see what the label hysteria was hiding. Let's open that cabinet and start with the label makers, the Greeks. In the Hippocratic corpus, writers framed women's bodies through humours and plumbing. Menstruation was purging, childbirth was a risky reset, and many symptoms, chest tightness, choking, dizziness, fainting, were filed under a single idea. The womb had shifted position and was pressing on vital organs. If a patient couldn't breathe or kept collapsing, the explanation was mechanical. A mobile uterus had wandered upward and needed coaxing back. Plato added philosophy to the mix. In the Timaeus, he described the womb as an animal, restless when barren, roaming when unsatisfied. It sounds wild today, but it neatly fit Greek biology and social norms. Women were cooler and wetter, humourally speaking, prone to stagnation if sex, pregnancy or menstruation didn't balance them. The recommended fixes followed that logic: fumigations with sweet smells near the genitals to lure the womb downward, foul smells at the nose to drive it away from the chest, warm baths, gentle movement, marriage and regular intercourse. It was a closed system. Symptoms confirmed the theory. The theory prescribed common-sense regimen. Not every ancient physician agreed. Soranus of Ephesus, 2nd century CE, criticised the roaming organ idea and focused instead on nerves, posture and lifestyle. He preferred calm nursing, compresses and careful diagnostics to scented smoke. But Galen's towering influence in late antiquity and beyond kept humoral explanations dominant, and uterine suffocation remained a handy umbrella term. Aretaeus of Cappadocia described dramatic choking fits that later readers slotted right under hysteria. By late Roman times, the toolkit, fumigations, pessaries, baths, diet, was standardized enough to travel. It traveled first east. In late antique Alexandria and then Abbasid Baghdad, 8th to 10th centuries, Greek medical texts were translated into Syriac and Arabic. Scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq systematized Galen and Hippocrates. Clinicians such as Al-Razi, Rhazes and Al-Zahrawi, Abul Qasis added case notes and procedures, and Avicenna folded it all into the canon of medicine. There, Iktinaq al-Rahim, uterine suffocation, appears as a recognizable syndrome with triggers, retained menses, strong emotions, risk factors, temperament, climate, and layered therapies, regimen first, drugs second, procedures last. The framework stayed humoral, but the organization became textbook clean, perfect for export. Export arrived via Italy and Spain. In the 11th century, Constantinus Africanus brought Arabic compilations to Salerno, Europe's most practical medical school. His Latin translations, Pantegni from Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi, Viaticum from Ibn Jazar, circulated recipes and rationales that European readers recognized as Hippocratic Galenic, just better edited. Around the same milieu came the Trotula Ensemble, 3 texts on women's health associated with the school of Salerno. Whether authored by a single Trotula or compiled over time, they offered exactly the sort of how-to guidance medieval practitioners wanted: what to observe, which scents to use, how to prepare pessaries, and when to recommend sex or marriage. Suffocation matricis, uterine suffocation, appears here as a go-to diagnosis with concrete steps. Next stop, Toledo. In the 12th century, Gerard of Cremona and other translators rendered Avicenna's canon and related works into Latin. This is the moment the wandering womb package, Greek theory, Arabic systematization, Latin accessibility, hit the university circuit. By the 13th century, students in Bologna, Montpellier and Paris learned a consistent story. Women's bodies were colder, wetter. Obstruction and retention led to vapours. Vapours caused choking and fainting. Treatment proceeded from regimen to remedies, from smells and heat to more involved measures. The vocabulary shifted, but the pathway held. Why did it stick? 3 reasons. First, it fit the reigning model of the body. Humoral theory explained almost everything in terms of balance and flow. Uterine suffocation slotted into that logic without strain. Second, it aligned with social prescriptions. If marriage and sexual regularity were also medical advice, physicians, priests and families could agree on a plan without arguing about power or money. Third, it produced visible rituals of care, fumigations, baths, compresses that comforted patients and impressed onlookers, even when the underlying condition was epilepsy, migraine, anemia, trauma, or grief. By the later Middle Ages, the diagnosis had paperwork behind it, scholastic commentaries, recipe books, and case reports repeating each other across generations. Midwives and wise women often treated similar symptoms with warmth, rest, and herbs, but university graduates had the Latin suffocatio, vaporis, retentio, and the institutional backing. So the idea didn't just survive, it standardized. From Hippocrates to Salerno to Paris, the wandering womb walked, ironically, because the books carried it, the schools graded it, and everyday life kept producing symptoms that seemed to prove it true. Only with early modern anatomy, neurology, and changing views of women's agency would the label start to crack. To understand why wandering wombs stuck, you have to step inside the operating system medieval medicine used for everything, humours. Bodies were thought to run on 4 fluids: blood, hot, moist; yellow bile, black bile, cold, dry; and phlegm, cold, moist. Health meant balance, illness meant surplus, deficit or misplacement. Within that grid, most authors labelled women as naturally colder and moister than men. Not colder as in personality, but literally lacking the innate heat that in classical theory finished cooking food into good blood and in men into semen. Less heat meant weaker concoction, more leftovers, more stagnation. Moisture added slipperiness and softness, porous tissues, leaky boundaries, changeable states. That composite, cold plus moist, became the shortcut explanation for why women seemed medically unstable. Aristotle supplied the headline, "Woman is a less perfect man in biological terms," and Galen gave it lab notes. If men's hotter bodies baked fluids into stable form, women's cooler bodies left residues, unspent blood vented as menstruation, postpartum lochia and various discharges. Retention of those fluids, the theory went, generated vapours that rose and disturbed the head and chest. Translate that into symptoms, and you get a long list: fainting, choking, dizziness, brain fog, low mood, insomnia, palpitations, all mapped neatly to cold, moist excess and the idea of things rising where they shouldn't. That framework guided everyday advice. Diet? Favour warming, drying foods, roasted meats over cold salads, spices like cinnamon, ginger and pepper, a little spiced wine instead of water. Lifestyle? Keep warm, avoid damp, don wool layers, sit near a hearth and don't sleep in cellars. Bathing? Warm baths with herbs to open pores and move stuck humours, followed by quick drying so the body didn't reabsorb chill. Exercise? Moderate movement to disperse vapours. Too much exertion could exhaust heat. Too little left moisture pooling. It's a tidy programme if you accept the premises. Because humours governed personality as well as physiology, writers also folded temperament into diagnosis. The phlegmatic type, cold and moist, was described as pale, slow, sleepy and averse to heat. That matched the stereotype projected onto many women, especially in winter or after childbirth. So the same grid that handled coughs and fevers also explained moods, energy levels and attitude. If a patient seemed listless or weepy, phlegm was winning. If she was restless or hot-tempered, maybe choler, hot, dry had spiked. The system offered a label for every behaviour, and hysteria could ride along. Crucially, cold moist made menstruation central. Regular menses were framed as a safety valve. Irregular or obstructed menses signalled danger. Physicians feared retentio, fluids trapped inside that might spoil and fume. That fear supported the suffocation matricis diagnosis, vapours rising from retained blood compressing the chest and throat. It also explains prescriptions that look bizarre now but were perfectly logical then, warming the pelvis, gently irritating the nose with pungent scents to pull the womb downward, recommending marriage and intercourse to restore rhythmic flows judged healthy. Geography and season kept the theory sticky. Northern climates were coded cold and wet. Winter was peak phlegm season. If a woman in a damp stone house felt heavy, foggy and tight-chested in January, the model predicted it. Age stacked on top. Youth was hot moist, old age cold dry. Women were already graded toward cold moist, so pregnancy, postpartum depletion or prolonged grief could tip the scales. When outcomes matched expectations often enough, the model felt confirmed, even when the real culprits were anemia, thyroid issues, migraine, trauma or simple malnutrition. Textbooks turned the model into muscle memory. Avicenna's canon organised symptoms by temperament and treatment order, regimen, drugs, procedures. The Trotula collections distilled gynecological practice into steps: observe colour, pulse, discharge, warm what is cold, dry what is moist, move what is stuck. University commentaries repeated the pattern, so apprentices encountered the same charts in Bologna and Paris that their teachers had memorised. Over time, cold and moist wasn't a debatable claim. It was the default setting you switched on unless strong evidence said otherwise. There was wiggle room. Soranus had doubted the roaming organ story long before. Some scholastics warned that not every fainting fit was uterine. Individual complexions mattered. Plenty of men were cold moist. Plenty of women were choleric or sanguine. Midwives emphasised context, fatigue, childbirth injuries, grief, and applied warmth and rest without the Latin. But authority ran with the universities, and their paperwork framed the intake questions, the bedside rituals, and the fees. The social payoff kept the logic in place. If cold and moist bodies were inherently prone to flux, then stability required supervision, regular schedules, approved diets, managed emotions, and often marriage. That medical story lined up neatly with moral and legal ones. A label that solved many problems, clinical, domestic and political, didn't need perfect accuracy to survive. It needed to be serviceable. And for medieval Europe, the cold and moist woman was precisely that. A serviceable model that made symptoms legible, prescribed visible care, and validated existing hierarchies, until anatomy, experimentation, and new ideas about women's agency began to pry the model apart. Call it the medieval master key. Once cold and moist framed women as prone to flux, a single diagnosis could unlock almost any puzzling complaint. Physicians and clerics didn't have scans or lab tests, they had patterns. When a woman fainted in church, lost her voice after an argument, woke with chest tightness or felt prickling in her hands, the tidiest way to file the case was uterine suffocation, the womb and its vapours disturbing the vital parts. The label sounded precise, but it was wonderfully elastic, and that elasticity is exactly why it lasted. Start with fainting. Case notes describe women collapsing during summer heat, long fasts or sudden shocks, and reviving when attendants waved aromatics under the nose or pressed warm cloths to the belly. Today we might divide those episodes into dehydration, anemia, panic, arrhythmia, or low blood sugar. Medieval writers read them as vapours rising when menses were retained or digestion left crudities behind. The same framework handled choking, the famous globus sensation, as if a ball were stuck in the throat. Practitioners called it suffocatio matricis, blamed vapours for constricting the chest, and reached for smell-based tricks, sweet scents below to lure the womb downward, sharp ones at the nose to drive it off the airway. Next came fits, an umbrella term wide enough to shelter epileptic seizures, psychogenic events, migraine auras and theatrical swoons. Textbooks told students to distinguish true epilepsy, supposedly marked by bitten tongues and incontinence, from uterine fits, yet the line was spongy. If attacks clustered around the menstrual cycle, began or ended with strong odours, or followed grief and shock, Many authors slid them under the uterine heading. That move wasn't pure superstition, it was pattern matching inside the only physiology available. If cold and moisture produced stagnation and stagnation produced vapours, then episodes that rose and fell with heat, smells, seasons and sex fit the chart. Temporary paralysis and numbness also joined the club. A drooping mouth, a shaking arm, legs that slept for hours. Modern readers think stroke, neuropathy or vitamin deficiency. The medieval explanations invoked cold invading the limbs or vapours obstructing the nerves that carried spiritus, the body's subtle energy. Treatment aimed to warm and dry. Mustard plasters, cupping, heated oils, frictions with wool, gentle exercise. If speech vanished for an afternoon, someone might write aphonia from suffocatio matricis. If a hand trembled, retained humours were said to jostle the channels. The same label converted mysteries into a to-do list. Because the diagnosis covered so much, it also dictated triage. First came regimen, food, sleep, warmth, modest movement. Then came smell tricks and pessaries compounded from mastic, musk, myrrh or rue. If those failed, bloodletting below or cupping might be ordered to draw excess downward. As a long-term fix, physicians often recommended marriage or renewed sexual activity to restore rhythms thought to keep flows regular. That last step reads like social policy in a white coat, and it was, but inside the model it seemed rational. Periodic flows prevent retention, retention prevents vapours, vapours prevent fits. Religion complicated and reinforced the picture. Confessors and exorcists saw many of the same symptoms and used their own playbooks. One parish might call convulsions demonic. The next town over, a physician would write uterine suffocation and light a brazier of herbs. Manuals began warning clergy not to cry possession when a known medical pattern fit, yet crossover was constant. Plenty of households tried both, psalms and rosewater, reliquaries and warming plasters. When either route delivered a calmer night, the diagnosis and the system behind it gained credibility. Markets favoured it too. Apothecaries profited from aromatic resins, spiced wines, warming salves and soothing syrups. Midwives sold practical care, heat, massage time. University men sold explanations and written regimens. No expensive instruments were required. Everyone could contribute to the cure. City ordinances that worried about damp housing, winter cold and foul air sat comfortably beside home remedies aimed at the same targets. The label stitched household, church, shop and town hall into one cooperative script. There were dissenters and refiners. Soranus had mocked the roaming organ idea long before, and some scholastics urged careful histories so epilepsy or heart disease wasn't missed. A few noted that iron can lift faintness, that grief needs company more than fumigation, that servants collapse from sheer overwork. But the flexible label kept winning because outcomes were mixed. If the patient improved after warmth and rest, the plan was vindicated. If she relapsed, retention must have returned. If she worsened, perhaps cooler weather or a dietary slip had tipped the balance. The model always had an answer. Sex and age helped the label travel. Young men with fainting fits might be called choleric. Older men with numbness, cold and dry. Women of childbearing age, especially in damp winters and stone houses, fit the uterine story best. That's why medical recipes, legal cases and parish notes echo each other. The same few terms, retentio, vaporis suffocatio, appear across genres. Everyone learned the flow chart from the midwife with a brazier to the university clerk with a quill. This one label, many ailments approach mattered beyond medicine. It gave families an action plan, told courts whether a woman was unfit or merely afflicted, and offered parishes a script for mercy. It simplified complex bodies into steps people could remember and act on. As long as those steps delivered visible relief, fewer faints, steadier sleep, the system felt trustworthy. Only when anatomy, neurology and improved public diet offered credible alternatives would practitioners begin prying the label off cases it had owned for centuries. So who actually got to slap the label on a woman's symptoms? Uterine suffocation, vapours or anything else? Short answer, the people with Latin licenses and lecture notes. By the high Middle Ages, learned medicine had moved into Europe's new universities, Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, and those schools turned diagnosis into a credentialed profession. If you wanted authority at the bedside, you first needed authority at the podium. The university track looked more like a marathon than an apprenticeship. Students started with arts, logic, natural philosophy, then advanced to medicine, where the syllabus ran on the Articella, a starter pack of Hippocrates, Galen, and late antique summaries, plus Avicenna's canon after the 12th century translation boom. The method was scholastic: read a passage, parse every sentence, reconcile contradictions, and extract rules. By the time a student sat for the licentia licence or doctoris doctorate, he'd memorised a small library and could quote authorities faster than most people could fetch water. That paper, signed by a faculty and blessed by a city or bishop, wasn't just a diploma. It was a passport into courts, guild halls, and wealthy homes. Licensing also created a wall. Universities admitted men. Women were functionally excluded from the lecture bench and therefore from the top tier of medical authority. That matters for our story because the people standardising women's illnesses were not women, and their case books leaned on the same male-taught framework. Cold and moist complexions, retention, vapours, suffocation mattresses. Midwives and empirics might say, she's exhausted and grieving, keep her warm and rested. But a university physician could write it in Latin, cite Avicenna, and bill for a regimen. When city councils or courts needed an expert opinion, guess which voice they called? Cities backed the gate. Many towns required practitioners to show proof of study or pass a local exam before charging fees. Faculties in Paris and Montpellier issued statutes: what could be prescribed, how often bleeds should be ordered, even fee schedules. That gave university men leverage over adjacent trades: surgeons, barbers, apothecaries, who worked by guild rules and hands-on skill. Surgeons stitched and set bones, barbers bled, apothecaries compounded. But physicians decided why the patient was ill and what the plan should be. If a surgeon bled without a physician's say-so, fines could follow. The message was clear: ideas outranked instruments. Paperwork multiplied the power. Learned doctors wrote consilia, formal consultation letters that travelled between cities with the patient's symptoms, pulse notes, and urine colour. A single consilium could be copied, sold, and cited for decades, turning one man's reasoning into a template for dozens of future cases. The more those letters repeated uterine explanations for fainting, choking, fits, or numbness, the more womb trouble became the safer standard label to reach for, especially in women of childbearing age. Print this logic often enough and it starts to feel like common sense. Meanwhile, midwives occupied a different lane. Municipal or ecclesiastical licensing, oaths about secrecy and emergency baptism, practical training at the bedside. They had authority in childbirth and postpartum care, and many were the first responders for the very symptoms physicians called hysterical. But their knowledge lived in kitchens, not lecture halls. When a midwife warmed, massaged and calmed a patient, she might get credit from the household. She rarely got to write the theory that explained the cure. If a case escalated to court or council, the university man's Latin sat in the record, not her observations. Were the learned doctors just gatekeeping for the sake of it? Not entirely. The university system did improve consistency. Standardised textbooks, shared terminology and treatment orders, regimen, drugs, procedures. It encouraged note-keeping and comparisons across cases, but it also filtered what counted as real medicine. A remedy without an authority might be dismissed as empirical. A woman healer without a license could be fined as a charlatan. In edge cases, convulsions, trances, voices, the clergy entered the chat, and debates over possession versus illness became turf wars between confessor and physician. Faculties published cautions against shouting demon when suffocation fit the signs. Exorcists warned against calling sin vapours. The patient got two competing frameworks and two bills. The social payoff for gatekeeping was huge. Families wanted certainty, councils wanted order, insurers, yes, medieval equivalents existed in some cities, wanted predictable fees. University medicine offered all three, plus paperwork to waive if a case went wrong. And because the curriculum leaned hard on humours and Avicenna, the same explanatory grid followed graduates wherever they set up shop. That's how a woman's faint in Paris, a choking fit in Pisa, and a tremor in Bruges could all land under uterine suffocation with strikingly similar plans: warmth, regulated diet, aromatics, rest, sometimes marriage. One label, many ailments, now with a seal and signature. Could women breach the wall? Rarely at the top. Salerno's tradition preserves names like Trota, evidence that women wrote and practiced, But as universities hardened their status in the 13th, 15th centuries, exceptions thinned. The result? Learned, male-staffed institutions defined illness from the podium, and everyone else, midwives, surgeons, households, worked around or under that definition. When you control the lectures, you control the labels, and for centuries those labels kept pointing back to the same place, the womb. If universities controlled the licenses, parishes controlled the meanings. After all, most women didn't live near a faculty office, but everyone lived in a parish. Since the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, required annual confession, priests became the default counsellors for anything that felt wrong in body or soul. The confessional wasn't a clinic, but it functioned like one for interpretation, a quiet booth where symptoms were sorted into moral categories and assigned cures in the language of penance, prayer, and habit change. Confessor handbooks, the how-to books for parish priests, taught clergy to map problems onto the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. Listless, can't get out of bed, can't pray, cry for no reason. That could be acedia, the noonday heaviness monks wrote about, prescribed spiritual structure rather than scented fumigations. Racing thoughts, insomnia, sudden anger, perhaps ira wrath or Timorph needing confession, restitution and a calmer routine. The same woman who in a physician's notebook was cold and moist with retained menses might in a priest's ledger be tempted by sadness and neglect of duties. 2 systems, 1 person. Sex and marriage sat right at the crossroads. Medical texts often advised intercourse or marriage to restore proper flows. Canon law talked about the debitum conjugal. The conjugal debt spouses owed each other. In practice, a confessor might tell a reluctant husband to fulfill his duty if a wife complained of suffocations and despair, or he might tell both spouses to abstain during Lent, Advent and feast eves, even if the physician had urged regular relations. When advice clashed, the family had to choose: remedy by regimen, doctor, or remedy by rule, priest. Either way, the priest's framing, sin, duty, abstinence, reconciliation, coloured how everyone understood the symptoms. Confessors also policed how people sought relief. Folk charms to move the womb, amulets and whispered incantations fell under superstitio in pastoral manuals. A woman who arrived smelling of burned herbs and wearing a charm packet might be told to throw it in the fire, give alms instead and visit a recognised shrine. St. Margaret for childbirth, St. Apollonia for tooth pain. The message wasn't do nothing but do it the church's way. That swap, from kitchen magic to sanctioned pilgrimage, shifted the meaning of the ailment, not just stuck humours, but a test of faith and obedience. Then there were the spectacular cases, convulsions, trances, voices. University authors warned against mislabelling every fit as demonic, and some parish guides echoed that caution. Still, the discernment of spirits belonged to clergy, and households often started with holy water, gospel readings and relics. If the episode quieted during prayers, many took it as proof of spiritual causation. If it calmed after warmth, rest and a change of diet, families credited natural causes. Plenty of households tried both in sequence, hedging bets. The upshot: priests didn't just forgive sins, they triaged meanings, and meaning determined the next steps. Penance itself worked like a behavioural prescription. A typical penance bundle: fast less strictly if you're fainting, sleep at proper hours, attend mass, recite set prayers, avoid quarrels, reconcile with a neighbour, reads like a cognitive behaviour plan with theology added. It gave families a checklist and, crucially, a clock. Do these things for a week, report back. Visible structure often helps anyone in distress. When the patient improved, the confessional model earned credit, both just as a physician's warming regimen did in other homes. Documentation amplified the parish voice. Priests kept libri memoriales, wrote letters to bishops and recorded notable cures at shrines. Those notes circulated as examples in sermons. A woman plagued by choking at night found relief after confession and alms. Repeat that story enough and the community learns to hear a neighbour's symptoms as a moral spiritual drama rather than a purely bodily one. Reputation followed. A woman with public fits might be encouraged to confess more strictly, avoid certain gatherings, or spend time at a convent guest house for quiet. All pastoral moves that also managed social risk. The parish also touched midwifery. Many towns swore midwives in before a priest, extracting oaths about emergency baptism and bans on charms. Midwives were indispensable, but the church set the boundaries of acceptable practice. When postpartum melancholy or sleeplessness hit, a midwife might suggest warmth, broth, and rest. The priest might add a blessing, a candle vow, and stricter avoidance of superstitious remedies. Again, two playbooks often combined in the same kitchen. Was this gatekeeping? Yes, but it also reflected demand. People wanted causes that made sense inside everyday life. Humours gave one kind of sense, confession gave another. The parish translated dizziness into discipline, choking into conscience, fits into trials, and numbness into neglect of order. That translation stabilised households. It told husbands, mothers-in-law and neighbours what to do. Pray here, abstain there, reconcile with so-and-so, stop sleeping in the damp loft. In doing so, it kept the one label, many ailments habit alive from the moral side, while university medicine kept it alive from the physiological side. Between pulpit and podium, symptoms rarely stood alone. They carried meanings, and meanings decided the cure. Between pulpit and podium, someone still had to do the actual caring, fetch the water, warm the bricks, calm the room, stop a faint from turning into a fall. That was the midwife's lane, with wise women, local healers, overlapping at the edges. If the university physician wrote the Latin and the priest wrote the penance, these women wrote the checklist. Doors latched, brazier lit, linens clean, broth on, neighbours organised. Their authority was practical, local and fast. Start with what they handled. Not just births, but the whole perimeter of women's health. Irregular menses, cramps, choking episodes at night, difficult lactation, fevers after delivery, prolapse, infant colic, and the 1,000 small complaints that don't make it into university concilia. A midwife's first tools were warmth and order. She moved the patient to a better room, padded the floor, propped the head, loosened laces, rubbed limbs with warmed oil, set a steaming bowl under the stool, and managed the crowd, one helper to the fire, one to the door, one to send for the priest if baptism might be needed. In a faint or fit, she tried simple reversals. Uncork the window if the air was stale, bring in aromatics if the air was cold, keep the face cool and the lower body warm. None of that needed a lecture note, and much of it worked. Midwives weren't rogue agents. In many towns they were sworn in before a priest or magistrate, promising emergency baptism, discretion and a ban on superstitious charms. Some cities paid an official midwife a small stipend to ensure at least one trained woman was available for the poor. They also had networks, aunts, daughters, neighbours, so skill passed along kitchens and courtyards rather than lecture halls. The knowledge base mixed observation, what helped last time, rules of thumb, don't cool a sweating body too fast, seasonal sense, more warming in winter, more airing in summer, and a light dusting of humoral language picked up from clients and apothecaries. Wise women straddled the border with folk medicine. They kept herb gardens and still rooms, traded tips with apothecaries and stocked a short list of reliables. Fennel and anise for windy bellies, sage and rosemary for warming rubs, chamomile for compresses, honey and vinegar for simple syrups, wool for friction, linen for binding. They knew that sleepless mothers needed food before advice, that grief can look like illness, and that a well-timed visit from friendly gossips, the women invited to support a birth, could stabilise a household. If a case looked dangerous, high fever, foul discharge, prolonged bleeding, they sent for the physician or priest. The triage sense was part of the job. So why did academic theory eclipse them? Paper and prestige. University men wrote, midwives acted. When the city council filed a report, it quoted the physician's Latin, not the midwife's checklist. When a printer needed content, he typeset Avicenna and scholastic commentaries, not Mrs. Marjorie's keep the feet warm routine. Even texts about women's health that preserved practical wisdom, the Trotula ensemble from Salerno, arrived folded into a learned frame, copied by men, cited by faculties. Over time, what counted as real medicine was whatever could be footnoted. Licensing reinforced the hierarchy. Physicians could fine surgeons or barbers for working beyond their art. Clergy could scold midwives for charms. Councils could order no remedies without leave. Midwives still worked. Cities needed them. But their explanations were downgraded to experience, while the physicians became cause. In mixed cases, the classic fainting, choking suffocation, a household might call the midwife first, see the attack ease with warmth and time, then hear a physician pronounce afterward that vapours had been dispersed and the regimen had succeeded. The outcome credited the theory, not the hands. Cost and class played a role too. Wealthy households staged care like a small production. Physician for diagnosis, apothecary for compounds, midwife for operations, priest for blessings. Poorer homes relied heavily on midwives and wise women, and only occasionally saw a physician. That skew means the written record, produced by literate elites, overrepresents learned medicine and underrepresents the routines that actually kept most people going. Add suspicion to the mix. Wise women who used spoken charms or curious amulets risk being labelled superstitious. In some seasons and places, that slipped toward witchcraft accusations. Confessors, manuals told priests to redirect patients from old wives' remedies to sanctioned prayers and shrines. The safest path for a midwife was to frame the same actions: warmth, rest, simple herbs, inside acceptable language. No charms, thank you, just rosemary water and a clean bed. Many did exactly that. None of this means midwives rejected learned ideas. Plenty absorbed humoral logic in plain language. She runs cold. The damp is hurting her. Let's dry things out before we add more wine. What they didn't need was the grand theory to act. If a mother fainted after fasting in a long church service, the fix was food, heat, air, quiet. If a fit followed grief, the fix was company, sleep, and less stimulation, plus a priest if the family wanted consolation. The label, womb vapours melancholy, mattered less to them than the routine. When early modern anatomy and obstetrics eventually challenged university stories, midwives were still there, still catching babies, still managing crises, still doing the first sensible things. But for the medieval centuries we were walking through, the scoreboard tilted to the writers. Academic theory sat in statutes, sermons and ledgers. Practical care lived in rooms that didn't leave footnotes. That's what eclipsed looks like in history. Not absence of light, but brighter light elsewhere. The midwife's candles kept burning. The university's pages simply cast the longer shadow. By the time university medicine set the terms and midwives worked within them, one Latin label sat ready like a pre-printed file folder: suffocatio matricis, uterine suffocation. In practice, it meant, when in doubt about a woman's sudden choking, tight chest, or terrifying night episodes, start here. Textbooks from Salerno to Paris taught students to see a pattern: cold and moist bodies, retained flows, rising vapours, and a womb whose proximity to the vital parts made trouble. The appeal was obvious. One framework covered 3 of the most alarming but common complaints. 1. Choking, the famous lump in the throat. Medical handbooks described women who felt as if a ball rose from the belly to the throat, blocking breath and speech. Today we'd call it globus sensation or tie it to panic, reflux or thyroid issues. Medieval physicians put it under the uterine heading when the spell came without fever, followed strong emotion or fasting, and recurred around the menstrual cycle. Students learned tidy differentiations. If there's high fever or pus at the tonsils, think quinsy. If the patient revives with odours and warmth, think suffocatia. Treatment followed the smell logic every student memorised: sweet, warm scents below to draw the womb downward, and sharp pungent at the nose to push rising vapours away: musk, mastic, myrrh or rose below. Vinegar or asafoetida at the nostrils. Add a warm bath, loosen tight lacing, rub limbs with heated oil, and serve spiced wine or broth. Midwives did most of this instinctively. University men wrote it up and invoiced it. 2. Chest tightness and palpitations. Short breath without infection or stabbing side pain slid easily into the uterine folder. Texts told students to separate phlegmatic asthma, cold, damp lungs, worse in winter, wheeze that improves with expectorants, from uterine suffocation. No cough or phlegm, attacks wax and wane with menses, anxiety or faintness on top. Pulse and urine joined the picture. A small, slow pulse, cold, pale, thin urine, moist. The plan repeated the regimen ladder drilled in lectures. Start with non-naturals, sleep, diet, air, exercise. Move to simple drugs, warming aromatics, gentle purges if crudities were blamed. Escalate to procedures, cupping on the thighs or lower belly, occasionally bloodletting from the saphenous vein to draw congestion down. The closing advice often reads like social policy tucked into a chart. Regulate supper, Avoid damp cellars, keep the feet warm, and if unmarried or long abstinent, consider marriage to restore rhythms. Families heard a care plan. The city heard a call for order. Night terrors and the incubus. When patients woke gasping as if something sat on their chest, texts offered two scripts. Clergy leaned toward the incubus, a spiritual assailant, or towards sin guilt, disturbing sleep. Physicians translated the scene into airflow and vapours. Heavy late suppers, a cold, damp room, retained menses, and a body whose natural heat was too weak at night to master rising fumes. Students were told to ask clockwork questions. What did she eat? Where does she sleep? When is her month? Did this begin after childbirth? Remedies were practical. Earlier supper, lighter foods, no wine late, sleep on the side, not the back, warm bricks at the feet, air the chamber by day, fumigate the room, not just the body, with rosemary or juniper, and keep a bowl of hot water nearby for quick steam. If episodes clustered with the cycle, physicians doubled down on pelvic warmth and gentle laxatives to open blockages. If prayers helped, fine, combine them, but the student was warned not to skip regimen because the household preferred an exorcism. Across all three textbook cases, the diagnostic dance looked similar. Step 1, rule out fevers and wounds, send for the surgeon if you find them. Step 2, take a quick cycle history, regular obstructed postpartum. Step 3, read the room, cold, damp housing, tight clothing, long fasts. Step 4, apply the warm down, cool up routine and observe. If the patient improved, the label stuck. If not, move sideways to melancholy or phlegmatic lung trouble. It was a flowchart before flowcharts. Two things kept suffocation mattresses sticky. First, visible rituals, odour therapy, baths, cupping marks, steaming bowls. Families saw action, not mystery. Second, shared language. Apothecaries sold the aromatics, midwives managed heat and rest, priests could bless the fumigation and recommend earlier suppers during fast seasons. Everyone had a part, so the label coordinated the household rather than splitting it. Of course, the catch-all sometimes hid other problems: epilepsy, anemia, arrhythmias, asthma, postpartum thyroid swings, or the plain fact of exhaustion and grief. Dissenters existed. Careful authors noted bitten tongues, think epilepsy, or unilateral weakness, think apoplexy, as red flags. But in the majority of ordinary reversible episodes, church fainting after a fast, a night panic in a cold room, a throat lump during an argument, the uterine script produced enough relief to earn another century in the syllabus. And because the universities owned the syllabus, the pattern propagated. A woman in Bruges who woke gasping sounded like a case a Paris graduate had just copied from Avicenna by way of Salerno. The midwife's warmed oil and the physician's Latin diagnosis met at the bedside, but only one of them travelled in ink. That is how a catch-all becomes a standard, not because it explains everything perfectly, but because it trains everyone to do the same sensible first things, especially when the night is cold, the supper was heavy, and the patient needs both warmth and a plan. If suffocatio matricis became the classroom default, that's because the classroom ran on a few superstar compilers and a very practical school. Enter Avicenna, Constantinus Africanus, and the Salerno tradition, the trio that turned scattered case wisdom into a repeatable syllabus. Start with Avicenna, Ibn Sina, d. 1037. His canon of medicine didn't just list remedies, it organised how you think at the bedside. Book 1 laid out principles, elements, humours, temperaments, the non-naturals like air, diet, sleep, exercise, emotions. Books 2 far marched from simples, individual drugs, to compound medicines and organ-by-organ diseases. 2 habits mattered for our story. First, the canon drilled the order of treatment. Begin with regimen, fix air, food, routine, then try simples, and only then escalate to strong compounds or procedures. Second, Avicenna systematised patterns that medieval Latin readers would map onto women's complaints. Retention vapours, choking, fainting, fits. He didn't invent uterine suffocation, but he gave it chart lines, triggers, retained menses, cold damp, signs, small slow pulse, pale urine, periodicity around the cycle, and stepwise responses, warmth, aromatics, evacuations, then watch. Now meet Constantinus Africanus, D.C. 1087, the Tunisian-born translator who parked himself at Monte Cassino and pumped Latin Europe full of Arabic medicine. His greatest hits include the Pantegni from Ali ibn al-Majusi, Hail Abbas, the Viaticum from Ibn al-Jazar, and the Isagodge tradition that fed the Articella, the student starter pack, for centuries. Constantinus didn't just translate, he package engineered concise, teachable, authority-stamped texts fit for lecture and exam. Through him, Latin students met a cleaned-up Galenism filtered by Arabic clinicians who loved differential diagnosis and tidy sequences. Observe, classify, treat by ladder. That style makes womb suffocation feel less like folklore and more like protocol. Then there's Salerno, Europe's first long-running medical school with a reputation for practical bedside sense. Salerno lived at the crossroads, monks, merchants, Jews, Greeks, and Arabic texts moving through southern Italy. Two outputs framed everyday practice. One was the Trotula Ensemble, 3 texts on women's health, cosmetics, gynecology, obstetrics, associated with the school of Salerno. Whether or not a historical trotter wrote them all, the set bundled doable steps. What to inspect, colour, odour, discharge, how to apply warmth or drying, which pessaries and fumigations to try, when to call for intercourse, and when to rest. The other was the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a wildly popular verse handbook of lifestyle rules. Eat light at night, avoid damp rooms, balance seasons. Put those together and you get the daily operating manual that kept households running between rare visits from university physicians. How did these strands lock together? Through translation hubs, Salerno, later Toledo, university syllabi, Bologna, Montpellier, Paris, and copy culture. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, Avicenna's canon, now in Latin via translators like Gerard of Cremona, sat on desks beside Constantinus's compilations and Salernitan handbooks. Students learned the same moves in different wrappers. Read the complexion, check the season and housing, ask about the cycle, start with regimen, deploy aromatics and heat, keep the patient out of cold, damp rooms. When choking or night terrors appeared without fever or phlegmy cough, the suffocatia file opened almost by muscle memory. This trio also explains why the catch-all diagnosis kept winning. Avicenna contributed structure, a reason to start simple and visible, regimen, sense, baths. Constantinus contributed portability, compact Latin textbooks any lecturer could teach from and any city could license against. Salerno contributed practical glue, recipes and routines midwives and householders could actually follow. Everyone could participate, the apothecary selling mastic and myrrh, the midwife warming bricks and rubbing limbs, the priest blessing the house and banning dubious charms, because the shared script was understandable without a laboratory. There were frictions. Some scholastics, reading closer, cautioned, not every convulsion is uterine. Watch for bitten tongues, think epilepsy. Sudden one-sided weakness, think apoplexy. Salernitan texts sometimes preserved remedies that university men side-eyed as empirical. And Constantinus has been accused by modern scholars of abridging or blending sources a little freely. But in the medieval classroom, those were footnotes. What mattered was a repeatable pathway that produced enough relief, often enough to feel reliable. So when you see suffocatia matrices stamped across casebooks from Bruges to Bologna, you're not seeing a single superstition, you're seeing the Avicenna Constantinus Salerno stack at work. A big synthesizer, Avicenna, gave the model its skeleton. A great packager, Constantinus, made it teachable. And a hands-on school, Salerno, made it usable in real rooms with real people. That's how a label becomes more than a label. It becomes a workflow. And workflows, once institutionalized, tend to outlive the doubts that nibble at them. If the Avicenna Constantinus Salerno stack gave medieval medicine its workflow, smell-based therapy was one of the most visible steps in that flow. Texts taught it, apothecaries stocked for it, and midwives could execute it with household tools. In the standard ladder, regimen first, then simples, then procedures, fumigations and odours sat right after the basics of warmth, rest and diet. For cases filed under suffocatia matrices, choking, chest tightness, night terrors without fever, students learned a simple rule: pleasant, warming aromatics below, sharp, pungent irritants at the nose. The theory behind the smells. Within humoral physiology, women were commonly classed as cold and moist. Retention, especially of menses, was thought to generate vapours that rose and disturbed breathing, voice and sleep. Scent had 2 jobs in this model. Qualities. Many aromatics were coded warm, dry, so their fumes were believed to thin and disperse stagnant moisture. Direction. Authorities repeated the old claim that the womb responds to odours. Sweet scents attract downward, harsh scents repel upward, thereby pulling trouble away from the chest and throat. You didn't have to believe the organ literally roamed to use the protocol. You only had to accept that strong odours could redirect vapours and stimulate breath. How it looked in practice, the kit was simple. A brazier with embers, a perforated stool or chair, bowls, cloths, oils and a handful of aromatics. One common setup sat the patient on a stool with a small brazier beneath, not touching the body, fumigating the pelvic region with a gentle plume, while an assistant held a pungent cloth to the patient's nose. Below, sweet warm, mastic, myrrh, frankincense, storax, benzoin, rose petals or oil, sandalwood shavings, sometimes musk or ambergris in wealthier homes. These might be sprinkled on coals, infused in warm wine for steam, or shaped into pessaries with wax or wool for local warmth and scent. At the nose, pungent, strong vinegar, rue, garlic, onion, mustard, castoreum, beaver secretion known in medieval materia medica, or simply burnt feathers, hair, cheap, accessible irritants that reliably provoked a gasp or cough. Texts paired odour with frictions, rubbing limbs with warmed oils, foot warming, heated bricks or salt bags, and posture, upright or side-lying rather than flat on the back. For night terrors, manuals added room fumigation, rosemary, juniper, laurel, and earlier, lighter suppers to reduce nocturnal heaviness. Who did what? Physicians prescribed the sequence and wrote it up in Latin. Consilia, lecture notes. Midwives, wise women, handled setup and monitoring, managing heat, distance and time, loosening laces, keeping air moving, calming the room. Apothecaries supplied the trade goods, resins, woods, oils, and mixed pessaries and ointments to recipe. Because each role had a piece, smell therapy coordinated the household, an intervention visible to family members, legible to clergy, no forbidden charms required, and billable by the university man. Why it persisted? First, repeatability. Anyone could assemble vinegar, onions, and a brazier. Richer homes swapped in storax or musk. But the mechanism, gentle heat below, sharp stimulus above, was the same. Second, signals. Odour therapy produced immediate observable effects. Deeper inhalation, cough, tearful eyes, a warming flush. When a faint aborted or a throat lump eased, the ritual earned trust. Third, fit with regimen. Smells didn't replace the basics. Warm bed, earlier supper, less damp air. They sat neatly on top of them, reinforcing the sense of a stepwise plan. Safety? Skepticism and boundaries. Handbooks cautioned about burns and smoke. Keep coals low and indirect. Use steam or warm oils for longer sessions. Stop if the patient wheezes or the face flushes too darkly. Learned authors also flagged red flags. Bitten tongue, think epilepsy. One-sided weakness, think apoplexy, stroke. Fever or foul sputum, think infection. In those cases, do not persist with uterine protocols. Call a surgeon or change the diagnosis. Clergy manuals discouraged amulets and spoken charms, but generally accepted fumigation if framed as natural remedy. Some even recommended room fumigation alongside prayer for troubled sleepers. Costs and supply. Aromatics rode Mediterranean trade routes. Frankincense, myrrh via the Levant, storax ben through Italian merchants, musk, ambergris as luxury items. For poorer households, the vernacular substitutes, vinegar, onions, rue, mustard, kept the protocol affordable. That economic flexibility helped the method spread from noble bedrooms to village kitchens. Did it work? By modern categories, odour therapy likely helped vasovagal faints, panic-linked globus, and nocturnal anxiety. Pungent smells trigger reflex inhalation, warmth lowers muscle tension. The ritual itself reduces fear. It would do little for structural lung disease or a major seizure, which is why the best medieval guides insisted on quick differentials. Still, because many everyday episodes were reversible with heat plus air plus stimulus time, success reinforced the label, suffocatio, and the method that travelled with it. A step that outlived the syllabus, and even as anatomy and neurology advanced, the odour step proved sticky. Early modern anti-hysteric kits kept castoreum and asafoetida, later centuries swapped in smelling salts. The logic, stimulate breath, redirect the episode, then fix the routine, was medieval, but the bottles changed. In short, sweet below, sharp at the nose wasn't a quirky footnote. It was a standardized, teachable and household-ready intervention that fit the Avicenna Constantinus Salerno workflow. That is why it shows up again and again in casebooks and recipes. A small, repeatable act that made a big, memorable difference often enough to keep the catch-all diagnosis in business for centuries. By the time odour therapy and warming regimens had been tried, many handbooks moved to a third highly social step in the suffocation matrices workflow: prescriptions of the bed. In plain terms, physicians frequently advised marry, resume intercourse, or restore the usual flows. It sounds like moralizing from the pulpit, but it came straight out of humoral physiology. If women were classed as cold and moist, then anything that safely warmed, stirred, and evacuated could counter stagnation. Sexual arousal, in the inherited Galenic model, quickened pulse and breath, heated the lower abdomen, and promoted evacuation of menstrual blood when due, and of seed in the two-seed theory many medieval writers still assumed for conception. Within that framework, recommending sex was not prurient, it was a long-term regimen meant to keep blockages from forming in the first place. Salonitan gynecological compendia, the Trotula ensemble, are frank about this ladder. First regimen, diet, warmth, rest, then aromatics and local applications, and, if the patient is of age and status, coitus within marriage to maintain healthy courses. Latin university comries that leaned on Avicenna systematized the same point. When fainting, chest tightness or night choking clustered with retentio, missed or scant menses, in an otherwise a febrile woman, you worked down the list and ended with counsel intended to regularize rhythms. If the patient was unmarried, the advice might be marriage when appropriate. If she was married but separated, reunite if possible. If her husband was present but relations infrequent, resume with moderation. The reasoning was mechanical. Periodic warmth and motion in the pelvic region were thought to keep humours thin and moving. This is where medicine collided, often smoothly, with canon law. Medieval marriage doctrine described the debitum conjugale, the mutual conjugal debt spouses owed each other. Persistent refusal by either party could be a legal wrong. A physician's written regimen that mentioned restoring relations gave a wife rhetorical leverage with a reluctant husband and vice versa. But the same confessional manuals that policed charms also set calendars: abstinence on fast days during Lent and Advent, on certain vigils, and for set periods postpartum. A household that followed the church year strictly might watch symptoms worsen in long abstinence periods. Others quietly ignored the stricter schedules when health seemed at stake. In effect, priests and physicians negotiated the calendar in the patient's kitchen, the doctor arguing physiological benefit, the confessor arguing discipline and licit times. Most families split the difference. Not every case could take the bed prescription. Widows, nuns, vowed continence, and women whose marriages were impossible for legal or economic reasons required alternates. Texts recognised this and doubled down on substitutes: more vigorous walking without chill, dry rubbing with wool, hot compresses, carefully timed baths, and regular fumigations. The point was to imitate, without scandal, the warming and moving effects that intercourse supposedly provided. Even within marriage, physicians warned against excess. Too frequent relations were thought to exhaust innate heat, producing new weakness. The aim was moderation and rhythm, not license. Class shaped how these prescriptions were delivered. Wealthier homes could stage the full protocol: doctor's letter, apothecary's aromatics, midwife's management, priest's blessing, ending with the line about restoring relations. Poorer households, which relied more heavily on midwives and less on university men, heard the same logic translated: keep warm, keep a schedule, avoid long cold nights alone if you can, with sex advice folded prudently into neighbourly counsel. Because university writing supplied the paper trail, the elite version is what survives most vividly in concilia and commentaries. There were risks and counterpressures. Physicians knew pregnancy carried hazards, and many noted postpartum windows where resuming intercourse too soon increased infection or hemorrhage. They also understood lactation could suppress menses and thus alter the flow they were tracking. So regimens after childbirth emphasised rest, warmth and diet, not a rush back to bed. Meanwhile, municipal statutes and household economies sometimes pushed in the opposite direction. Dowries and alliances made marriage a policy tool, and medical advice that marriage restores health could be cited opportunistically in family negotiations. Did bed prescriptions help? For many reversible, non-febrile episodes, vasovagal faints, anxiety-linked choking, winter heaviness in damp housing, the broader schedule that came with the advice probably did. Earlier suppers, warmer rooms, regular sleep, predictable routines. Adding sex within marriage may have provided warmth, relaxation, and social reassurance that in turn reduced recurrence. But the same label could miss anemia, thyroid disease, cardiac issues, or trauma, which is why careful authors inserted red flag lists and insisted on regimen first, observation second. What mattered historically is that marry, resume, restore, flow fit the workflow. It came after visible remedies, fumigation, baths, and before expensive or hazardous ones. It matched canon law's language of duty, and it gave families a stable, socially sanctioned plan to prevent relapse. In a world where physicians sold explanations, midwives sold competence, and priests sold meaning, bed prescriptions sat at their intersection. They turned a catch-all diagnosis into a household schedule. And as long as that schedule produced enough steady weeks to satisfy everyone at the table, the label that justified it, suffocatio matricis, remained very hard to dislodge. Prescriptions of the bed put physicians inside the same decision space as confessors and household elders. Once intercourse, abstinence, and restoring flows became moving parts of treatment, morality entered the chart. Case notes did not read like sermons, but they encoded status: maiden, wife, widow, vowed religious, and mapped symptoms to expectations about desire and chastity. The result was a hybrid file. Physiology explained the mechanism. Moral categories set the limits and sequence of care. In humoral terms, desire was heat and motion, chastity was restraint and potentially cold. Textbooks treated both as clinical variables. Too much sex risked exhausting innate heat, weakness, palpitations, sleeplessness. Too little, in a patient already classified cold and moist, risked retentio and vapours, fainting, choking, night terrors. Hence the constant refrain, moderation. The same symptom set could yield opposite bedside orders depending on the moral context. A married woman with cyclical choking might be told to resume relations. A nun with identical episodes would be steered toward baths, fumigation, exercise, and stricter routine. The physiology stayed, the path changed because the status changed. Confessional practice reinforced the mapping. Since annual confession was required, many households arrived at the physician with a prior moral reading. She fasted too hard. They have abstained this Lent. There is strife between spouses. Penance plans, earlier suppers, regular sleep, reconciliation with a neighbour, abstinence on set days, looked like a behavioural regimen, and physicians often folded them into the medical ladder. Fix the non-naturals, air, diet, sleep, exercise, emotions, in ways that also satisfied the parish. When the patient improved, both moral discipline and medical order took credit. At the same time, morality limited examination and evidence. Ideals of modesty meant learned physicians relied on pulse, urine and report rather than direct inspection. Midwives acted as intermediaries for pelvic observations. Virginity, vows, and household reputation constrained how boldly anyone could test a hypothesis. This pushed practice toward low-touch routines. Warmth, odour therapy, posture, diet well aligned with the suffocation matricis workflow. The moral boundary thus stabilised the very protocols that kept the diagnosis in play. Courts made the link explicit. Ecclesiastical cases about impotence, annulment, or failure of the debitum conjugale drew physicians as experts. A doctor's letter stating that regular intercourse would restore the courses could be cited to pressure a reluctant spouse. Conversely, a confessor might demand abstinence during fast seasons that the physician thought unwise. In contested marriages, doctors were asked whether an ailment was natural, excusing failure, or willful, a moral fault. Medical opinions became evidence about virtue and duty, not just about bodies. Symptoms tied to fear and sexuality, night terrors, incubus sensations, fits after scandal, sat on the border between sin and nature. Clergy could frame them as temptations or punishments. Physicians translated them into late suppers, cold rooms, and rising vapours. Many families pursued both lines: house blessing and rosemary smoke, confession and warming bricks, a vigil at a shrine and a revised sleeping posture. The double track kept morality present even when the immediate fix looked purely practical. Medicalised sin also appeared as prohibitions. Pastoral manuals condemned love charms and menstrual amulets as superstitia. Midwives learned to present the same effects, warming, scent, rest, without forbidden words or objects. Physicians avoided endorsing charms, but were happy to prescribe licensed aromatics, mastic, myrrh, storax, and approved routines that felt morally safe. Thus, the boundary between sin and remedy pushed practice toward marketable, church-tolerated tools. Another reason smell and heat therapies flourished. Gendered blame followed the logic. If a wife's retention persisted, case writers might hint at reluctance or household discord. If a husband was absent or indifferent, the same notes could be marshalled to argue for reconciliation or legal remedy. Widows and separated women were medically acknowledged. Substitute regimens stood in for sex, but morally scrutinised. Nuns received careful programmes that promised order without scandal. Everywhere, the category of the woman, not only her symptoms, shaped the plan. Did moral coding help patients? Where distress arose from overwork, fasting, cold housing and anxiety, the parish-friendly regimen, regular meals, sleep, warmth, reconciliation, often helped. Where problems were cardiac, neurological, endocrine or traumatic, morality could delay better answers by explaining relapse as failure of discipline. To their credit, some learned authors listed red flags that overrode status: fever, foul sputum, unilateral weakness, bitten tongue. In those cases, the chart broke from moral scripts and moved towards surgery or a different diagnosis. The long consequence is institutional. Once charts habitually recorded status, seasons, fasting, abstinence periods, marital rhythm, morality became a clinical field, as trackable as pulse and urine. That field steered choices toward interventions that were visibly decent, socially stabilizing and easy to supervise. It also kept suffocatio matricis resilient. As long as the label supported a plan that households and parishes could jointly enforce, it remained persuasive. In medieval practice, the body did not arrive at the bedside alone. It arrived carrying rules. Those rules lived, line by line, in the chart. Once morality became a clinical field, status, fasting, abstinence and marital rhythm recorded alongside pulse and urine, celibacy itself started to look like a risk factor, not a sin, a susceptibility. In a humoral world that framed women as cold and moist, periodic sexual arousal and intercourse inside marriage were thought to warm the lower abdomen and maintain the courses. Remove that rhythm, and in the standard logic, you increased the chance of retent blocked or scant menses, rising vapours and the usual cascade, fainting, choking, night terrors. That is why physicians, confessors and families often treated widows, nuns and maidens as medically tricky cases who needed special supervision and substitutes for what marriage supposedly provided. Maidens first. Puberty brought irregular cycles, light meals during fast seasons and cold damp housing in winter. Everything a university chart associated with retention. Because modesty norms limited examination, learned physicians leaned on pattern. Pallor, fatigue, dizziness, throat lump, and sleep disturbance around the same time each month equaled a suffocation matricis risk profile. The standard prescription marriage, when of age, was not always possible or desired, so texts recommended non-scandalous substitutes: warm baths, pelvic fumigations with sweet aromatics, vigorous but modest exercise, wool friction to dry excess moisture, and a stricter sleep and supper schedule. Midwives implemented most of this. Physicians wrote it up. The suspicion here was practical. A maiden lacked the regularizing mechanism the model expected, so households were urged to watch her regimen closely. Nuns posed a different problem: celibacy by vow within a regime that also prized fasting, night offices and enclosure. Convent life could mean cool stone cells, interrupted sleep and limited meat, conditions that, in humoral terms, tilted further toward cold and moist. Infirmarians, the convent caregivers, kept still rooms and herb gardens, and many houses had sensible rules: warm drinks after night prayer, heated bricks in winter, airing cells by day. Learned physicians consulted through grills or letters and prescribed the same ladder as for laywomen, minus any sexual counsel. Regimen first, then odour therapy, baths, frictions and room fumigation. Confessors framed recurrent episodes as trials permitted by God, but generally accepted natural remedies. Suspicion here took a theoretical form. Because the chart marked sexual rhythm as health-preserving, a vowed life required constant compensations to prevent retention and vapours. Well-run houses provided them. Poorly provisioned ones acquired reputations for nervous ailments. Widows sat between worlds. no longer bound to conjugal duty, often managing property and expected, in many places, to embrace modesty or even informal continence. Medical writers read widowhood as a change in regimen, loss of sexual warmth, altered diet, grief, and economic stress, any of which could tip a cold, moist body further out of balance. University concilia sometimes advised remarriage on health grounds. Canonists countered with the dignity of continence. In practice, families negotiated. Where money and alliances favoured remarriage, a physician's letter recommending it for restoring the courses became useful rhetoric. Where a widow controlled assets or preferred independence, midwives and apothecaries supplied the non-sexual substitutes, heat, baths, aromatics, regular walks and early suppers. Suspicion attached to irregularity. If symptoms recurred and the household seemed disorderly, neighbours and councils were quicker to attribute episodes to moral laxity or stubbornness rather than to cold rooms and thin meals. Law and procedure amplified the lens. Courts that heard disputes over impotence, annulment, or failure of the conjugal debt frequently called physicians as experts. Their opinions linked bodily regularity to sexual rhythm in ways that spilled into everyday talk. Parish manuals, for their part, warned clergy against charms, yet endorsed clean natural remedies. So odour therapy and warm baths were fine, but amulets were not. In all three statuses, maiden, nun, widow, the safest course for caregivers was to present the same warming and order routine within acceptable language, avoiding anything that smelled of superstition or scandal. Why did celibacy draw special suspicion rather than mere accommodation? 3 reasons. Model fit. In the prevailing physiology, sexual arousal and intercourse neatly explained why many married women avoided retention-type complaints. Remove that variable and the model predicted trouble unless compensated. Monitoring. Maidens, nuns and widows lived under institutional or household surveillance. Guardians, prioresses, confessors and councils, who all had reasons to record lapses and prescribe structure. More observers meant more notes, more diagnoses, and more opportunities to read symptoms through a moral frame. Economy and reputation. Celibate women could be economically independent, widows socially pivotal, nuns running estates or hospitals, or legally vulnerable, maidens under guardianship. Symptoms threatened those arrangements. Labelling episodes as retention vapours justified interventions, diet, sleep, enclosure adjustments without conceding political ground. To their credit, some physicians marked red flags that overrode status, fever, unilateral weakness, tongue-biting, foul sputum, and many convents ran competent infirmaries that met problems with food, heat and rest rather than moral lectures. Still, the chart's categories primed everyone to expect instability without marital rhythm. That expectation did not require hostility to celibacy, it required management of it. Hence the persistent tone in case records. Watch the maiden's routine, fortify the nun's cell and diet, give the widow warmth, order, and, if agreeable, a path back to marriage. In a system where diagnosis and discipline shared the same page, celibacy wasn't a moral offence, it was a clinical condition that demanded compensations and therefore attention. When celibacy, regimen and odour therapy didn't stop the collapses or fits, households sometimes climbed one more rung on the ladder, past the midwife and the physician, to the bishop's door. Since Lateran IV 1215 restricted public exorcisms to licensed clergy, bishops or their officials became the gatekeepers for deciding whether a spectacle was possession, sanctity or sickness. That judgment mattered. A wrong call could breed scandal or, conversely, leave a medical case untreated while everyone waited for a miracle. First triage, the parish. Most dramas started locally. A woman who fainted in church, woke gasping at night, or writhed during prayers would meet the parish playbook, holy water, gospel readings, relics if available, and confession. Handbooks warned priests not to label every convulsion demonic. University medicine had categories like suffocation matricis and epilepsy, and to note timing, after fasting, around the menstrual cycle, and setting, cold rooms, heavy suppers. If the episodes abated with warmth, earlier meals and odour therapy, the parish stopped there. If the symptoms escalated, voices, violent resistance to sacred things, or public disruption, the case moved upward. At the bishop's door, who gets a say? Canon lawyers, theologians and physicians all sat near this threshold. The bishop's officials examined whether an exorcism was licit, theologians weighed claims of visions or demonic attack, Physicians offered natural explanations. The University of Paris and other faculties repeatedly urged caution. Distinguish obsessio, external harassment, from possessio, full control, and both from morbus illness. The overriding rule was prudence. Minimise scandal, avoid superstition, and try the low-risk natural remedies first. Practical tests, not magic tricks. Examiners relied on patterns they thought hard to fake. Reaction to the sacred. Aversion to the sign of the cross, scripture or relics, especially when the object was hidden, raised flags. Calm or improvement during prayer suggested temptation borne patiently, not possession. Language and knowledge. Responses in Latin or sudden knowledge deemed beyond the person's station counted for something, though examiners knew how porous that line was in towns full of sermons and schools. Physical signs. Bitten tongue, incontinence and prolonged unconsciousness pointed toward epilepsy. One-sided weakness suggested apoplexy, stroke. Fever and foul sputum meant infection, not demons. Episodic throat constriction and chest tightness without fever often slid back into uterine suffocation in the physician's report. Course and triggers. Attacks that clustered with fasting seasons, wet winters, or the menstrual cycle fit the medical flowchart. Those that intensified precisely at holy times looked to some clergy like spiritual contest. But even then the advice was to combine prayer with regimen. Women who claimed visions complicated the script. Female sanctity in the later Middle Ages produced both admiration and scrutiny. Visionaries were questioned about obedience to confessors, humility and consistency over time. A woman whose trances yielded counsel useful to the community and who accepted correction might be guided toward the language of grace rather than hysteria. If the same woman also suffered choking fits or night terrors, the file could split. Spiritual director for the visions, physician for the symptoms. The aim was to keep categories tidy and public order intact. Why physicians kept being invited. Bishops did not want public exorcisms that later looked foolish. University medicine offered a de-escalation tool. A learned man could write that the case matched suffocation, prescribe warmth, baths, aromatics, earlier suppers and quiet, and thereby move the drama from the nave back into the household. If the patient improved, the bishop's caution was vindicated. If not, a discreet, licensed exorcism could proceed without having spurned natural means. Markets and meanings still overlapped. Apothecaries sold storax and myrrh for fumigations. Midwives managed heat and posture. Clergy blessed homes and discouraged charms. The same woman might leave the bishop's clerk with a note authorising a priest exorcist, and in the other hand, a physician's regimen that looked a lot like the parish's best advice. Earlier meals, warmer bed, side sleeping, rosemary smoke in the room. Success, when it came, rarely had a single author. Edge cases kept the debates alive. Some episodes worsened precisely in churches, others calmed only with prayer. Still others followed grief, assault, or grinding poverty more than any calendar of feasts. A few examiners, especially in urban centres, began to record psychosocial triggers in plain terms. Overwork in service, fasting beyond strength. Yet the institutional memory kept pointing to the same tree. Try regimen, observe cycles and seasons, escalate carefully, license exorcism only with cause. Why discernment dramas endured. 3 structural reasons explain their persistence. Shared jurisdiction. Body, soul and reputation were inseparable in medieval towns. Bishop, doctor and household each guarded part of the whole. Visible order. The staged sequence, parish, physician, bishop, showed the community that authority was acting without panic. Enough wins. Because many everyday episodes were reversible with heat, food, rest and calmer rooms, returning a case from the cathedral to the kitchen often worked. Each success reinforced the habit of natural first, spiritual with license, and the old diagnosis, suffocation matrices, stayed credible. In short, the bishop's door wasn't a portal into pure mysticism. It was a checkpoint where spiritual and medical scripts were aligned. The goal was less to prove what a fit really was than to pick the safest next step, the one most likely to steady the household and quiet the town. When a woman's collapses, cries or fits began to produce visions, prophecies or intense devotional speech, the case moved from household routine to contested holiness. The same institutions that managed possession versus illness, the parish, the physician, the bishop, now had to decide whether episodes signalled grace or delusion. Late medieval handbooks on discernment of spirits told clergy to test doctrine, obedience, and usefulness. University medicine urged a natural differential first. The practical outcome was a two-track inquiry. Does the woman submit to direction and speak orthodox theology, and do her symptoms fit known patterns like suffocation matrices or melancholy? The medical side offered recognizable boxes. Following Galenic and Avicennian models, examiners could classify trances as black bile melancholy, especially with fasting, insomnia, and ruminative thought, or as uterine suffocation, if episodes clustered with menstrual irregularity, choking, and night terrors. Both categories prescribed regimen, warmth, and odour therapy before any drastic measures. Cautious theologians, Jean Gerson is emblematic, explicitly advised consulting physicians to exclude natural causes before licensing public cult or exorcism. The aim was reputational safety. Better to attribute a vision to diet and sleep than to approve a mystic and face scandal later. Female visionaries who passed clerical tests typically had strong clerical editors and steady communities. Hildegard of Bingen's visions, for example, were vetted by churchmen and framed within orthodoxy. Her trances became a vehicle for theological commentary, not parish disruption. Bridget of Sweden's revelations were packaged for royal and papal audiences. Catherine of Siena's fasting and ecstasies were shepherded by Raymond of Capua, who insisted on obedience to confessors even as he promoted her sanctity. In each case, direction, doctrine, and social usefulness, letters, counsel, reforming zeal, outweighed the risk that an examiner might call the symptoms natural. Laywomen outside cloisters faced sharper scrutiny. Beguines and household mystics lacked enclosure and formal superiors. Their trances took place in marketplaces, parish aisles, or on roads. The same weeping, collapses, and sweetness in prayer that looked edifying in a convent could look disruptive in a town. Marjorie Kempe is a textbook case. Her loud sobbing and visionary speech triggered interrogations for heresy, tests of humility, and orders to keep decent silence in church. Officials sometimes chalked her crises up to weakness and overfasting. Others suspected delusion. Marjorie's survival depended less on a medical verdict than on letters of protection and a knack for demonstrating orthodoxy when challenged. Fasting, central to many women's piety, blurred categories further. Physicians saw prolonged abstinence as a risk for melancholy and vapours, especially in cold, damp housing. Confessors valued self-denial, but warned against excess and pride. Discerners asked whether fasting produced obedient stability, a sign of grace, or public spectacle and disdain for counsel, a sign of illusion. When doctors ordered more food and sleep and the woman complied and improved, authorities read the result as both medical good sense and spiritual humility. When she refused, suspicion rose, not necessarily of demons, but of vainglory or disorder. Physical marks and marvels prompted additional tests. Reports of stigmata, insensibility to pain in trance, or sustained sleeplessness brought physicians to check temperature, bleeding, and recovery time, while theologians checked catechism and prudence. Even a favourable judgment rarely bypassed regimen. Reduce night offices for the frail, warm the cell, lighten fasts, avoid solitary vigils, orders that look like clinical adjustments inside a spiritual file. The point was not to deny the extraordinary, but to manage it without inviting imitation or civic disturbance. Throughout, gender shaped credibility. The same elites who coded women's bodies as cold and moist expected instability without marital rhythm. That expectation made celibate women appear medically at risk and morally in need of supervision. A nun with obedient ecstasies in a well-run house met a ready script of allowances and compensations, heat, herbs, rest. A widow or maiden with public trances met questions about household order, guardianship, and diet. The status line, maiden, wife, widow, religious, guided next steps as much as symptoms did. Why did the label set tilt toward hysteria, in medieval terms suffocation, rather than sanctity in marginal cases? Because it offered a low-risk plan acceptable to all parties. Warm the room, regularise sleep and meals, use approved aromatics, add modest exercise, and monitor feasts and fasts. If episodes ebbed, the bishop avoided spectacle, the physician's science looked sound, and the parish regained quiet. If visions persisted alongside good order and orthodoxy, clergy could cautiously acknowledge grace without having earlier endorsed credulity. The headline is procedural, not cynical. Ecstasy or hysteria was not a pure either-or about truth. It was a workflow about public order and care. Direction first, regimen first, doctrine tested, humility observed. Only then did recognition or censure follow. That process explains why the same set of symptoms could crown a woman a mystic in one context and label her ill in another. It also explains why suffocatio matricis remained durable as a flexible, respectable category that offered actionable steps while higher authorities debated sanctity. It kept households stable and files closed. Outcomes medieval cities valued at least as much as perfect diagnoses. Once a case crossed from household routine into contested holiness, two licensed toolkits often faced each other across the same bed, the exorcist's rite and the physician's regimen. They treated the same cluster, faints, choking, night terrors, trances, but claimed different causes and carried different seals of authority. The rivalry was real, yet much of it ran through procedure and paperwork rather than open conflict. Who was allowed to act? Since Lateran IV, 1215, restricted solemn exorcisms to clergy with a bishop's leave, dioceses controlled access to the rite. Parish priests could use minor prayers, holy water and blessings, but public dramatic exorcisms required authorization. On the medical side, cities increasingly demanded proof of study or a local exam for physicians. Surgeons, barbers and apothecaries worked under guild statutes. In effect, bishops licensed meaning, universities licensed method, and civic councils tried to keep the peace. Two scripts at the bedside, the exorcist sequence, confession and instruction, fasting within reason, litanies, gospel reading, the sign of the cross, relics if available, holy water, and set adjurations performed in a controlled space with witnesses. Examiners sometimes tested with hidden sacred objects to check reactions. The aim was spiritual diagnosis and expulsion. The visible effect was order and restraint. The physician's sequence, quick differential, fever, wound, bitten tongue, one-sided weakness, questions about housing, diet, sleep, fasting, and menstrual cycle. Then the ladder, regimen, warmth, earlier suppers, better air, sleep regularity, odours, sweet below, pungent at the nose, baths, frictions, cupping as needed, and written guidance. The aim was to redirect vapours and stabilise routines. The visible effect was equally procedural. How each side argued cause. Exorcists leaned on reaction to the sacred, timing at holy seasons and moral context, public scandal, disobedience, pride. Physicians leaned on periodicity, episodes around menses or fasts, lack of fever or sputum, small slow pulse, coded cold, pale urine, coded moist, improvement with warmth and food, and relapse with damp rooms or long abstinence. Both sides had tells, and both knew they could be mimicked or misread, where the bishop's office sat. To avoid spectacle and scandal, episcopal officials often sequenced responses. Parish remedies first, medical regimen next. Licensed exorcism only if signs persisted or worsened. Theologians such as Jean Gerson recommended consulting physicians to exclude natural illness before authorizing cult or exorcism. That guidance gave physicians leverage. A concilium, formal opinion, could move a case out of the cathedral and back into the kitchen. If the woman improved under regimen, the bishop's caution looked wise. Overlap in the toolkits. Rival therapies weren't opposites. Both used structured ritual, sensory cues, and a calm environment. Incense at the rite and aromatics on the brazier both changed the air. Fasting moderated by a confessor and light suppers ordered by a doctor both altered the evening load. Litanies and set prayers created the same predictable cadence as a written regimen. Families routinely braided the two, blessing the house in the morning, rosemary smoke and warm bricks at night. Money, credit, and records. Exorcists were supported by stipends and alms, physicians charged fees, apothecaries sold resins and oils, midwives managed the room. Hagiographies recorded failures of doctors followed by saintly cures. Medical concilia recorded stubborn spiritual cases that finally yielded to regimen. Miracle books prized dramatic, instant relief. Physicians prized stepwise improvements that illustrated textbook order. Each genre pulled credit toward its own authorities, gender and status at the centre. Because university medicine coded women of childbearing age as cold and moist, uterine suffocation remained the medical default for non-febrile choking, fainting and night terrors, especially in maidens, nuns and widows, whose celibacy the chart treated as a risk for retentio. Exorcists saw many of the same women because their crises often occurred in churches or at shrines. Status-shaped outcomes. A nun with obedient trances in a well-run house often received regimen plus discreet prayers. A laywoman whose episodes disrupted markets drew faster recourse to diocesan control. When each side backed down. Good manuals listed red flags: fever, foul sputum, unilateral weakness or durable unconsciousness. Send for medical or surgical care. Do not persist with exorcistic theatre. Conversely, some physicians deferred when a patient showed strong, consistent aversion to hidden sacred things while remaining otherwise healthy. They noted the anomaly and stepped back. That mutual caution kept the public line. Natural means first, spiritual with license, both under supervision. Why the rivalry lasted and why it worked. The two therapies competed for explanation and prestige, but cooperated on risk control. Both promised to replace panic with procedure. Both offered authorities a way to be seen doing the right thing. Both delivered enough visible wins, fewer night panics, fewer collapses in church, to justify their place. In that environment, the catch-all medical label, Suffocatio Matricis, stayed strong. It provided a respectable pre-exorcism category with actionable steps, so bishops could delay spectacle without appearing idle. In short, medieval towns managed the same symptoms with parallel licensed scripts. Exorcists guarded doctrine and ritual boundaries. Physicians guarded the ladder of regimen and remedies. Most households used both when they could. The result was not a clean victory for either side, but a stable workflow that kept disorder low, reputations intact, and the patients surrounded by adults with plans. Exactly the conditions under which flexible diagnoses like uterine suffocation endure. If rival scripts kept disorder low, they did so by orbiting a single physiological hinge: menstruation. In the medieval chart, menses were not only a sign of female health, they were a purge, a built-in monthly evacuation that protected a naturally cold and moist body from dangerous retention. When that purge stalled, late, scant, irregular, or absent, the file for Suffocation Matricis opened quickly. The logic was straightforward inside humoral theory: retained, unspent fluid thickened, bred vapours, and rose to disturb the chest, throat, and head. Textbooks taught this as first principles. From Hippocratic summaries through Galenic handbooks and Avicenna's canon, students learned that women lacked the innate heat to perfect all ingested matter into good blood. The excess went out as menstrual blood. Regular flow therefore meant stable balance. Obstructed flow meant congestion, headaches, palpitations, faintness, throat lump, restless sleep. The Latin labels were tidy: retentio mensium, retention of menses, and suffocatio matricis, uterine suffocation, often appeared in the same paragraph with the same remedies in a ladder: regimen, aromatics, evacuatives, then procedures. Regimen came first because it was safe and cheap. Physicians and midwives asked season, diet, sleep and housing questions. Has she fasted beyond strength? Is the room damp and cold? Are suppers heavy and late? Are laces tight? Corrections followed a familiar pattern. Earlier, lighter evening meals. Warmer sleeping quarters, side sleeping rather than flat on the back. Gentle exercise, dry rubbing with wool, and a low brazier or heated bricks at the feet. If episodes tracked a cycle but did not carry fever or foul discharge, these adjustments were considered the low-risk fix and often worked. If regimen failed, texts moved to warming, drying agents aimed at reopening the purge. Here, the materia medica mixed household and trade goods. Emmenagogues, substances believed to promote menses, appear across Latin and vernacular recipe books: rue, pennyroyal, serving juniper, mugwort, myrrh, saffron, sometimes aloes. They were delivered as syrups, wines, baths, fumigations or pessaries, wool or wax carriers placed locally. Every sensible manual attached cautions: not in suspected pregnancy, because the same opener reputation made these plants controversial. Apothecaries and midwives knew the line they were walking. Many recipes hedge with milder aromatics: mastic, storax, rose, before stronger herbs. Direction mattered as much as ingredient. The standard choreography, sweet, warm fumes below, sharp, pungent at the nose, was billed as physics, not magic. Attract the womb or thin vapours downward while repelling irritants upward from the chest. Even authors who doubted literal womb movement kept the directional routine, reporting that a combined pelvic warmth and nasal stimulus often broke a faint or eased a night attack long enough to restore breathing and calm. The monthly purge would then ideally resume within days. Procedures sat last on the ladder. If a woman showed fullness without fever and repeated attacks, some guides advised cupping on the thighs or phlebotomy from the saphenous or ankle veins to draw down. Congestion, timed away from the expected period if bleeding was already heavy, or near it if flows were stubbornly absent. Midwives managed cups and heat. Surgeons or barbers handled venesection under a physician's order. Again, the rationale was directional: relieve pressure above by creating an exit below. Crucially, the same model policed excess. While irregular or absent menses were dangerous for retention, too much bleeding, menorrhagia, drained the very innate heat. The body needed to keep humours in motion. Textbooks therefore toggled: open what is stuck, restrain what is excessive. For flooding, writers reversed gears: cooling diet, rest, astringents, plantain, quinces, and avoidance of baths or exercise until strength returned. Month by month, households learned to steer between obstruction and depletion with the physician's paper and the midwife's practice. The calendar kept the theory sticky. Winter was coded cold and wet. Lent and Advent imposed long fasts. Stone housing held chill. It was unsurprising then that many fainting or choking cases clustered in late winter and early spring, the very seasons when humoral charts predicted retention risk. Add status, and the prediction sharpened: maidens without marital rhythm, nuns under enclosure and fasting rules, widows in grief with reduced diet. Each status came with compensations: more heat for nuns, exercise and baths for maidens, schedule and support for widows. When adjustments steadied the month, the underlying idea, menses as purge, felt confirmed. Diagnosis was necessarily indirect. Modesty norms limited examination. Physicians relied on pulse, urine, colour, story, and the midwife's observations. Urine, described as pale and thin, read moist, a small, slow-pulsed red, cold. Reported headaches, dizziness, and throat tightness near the expected period pushed the file toward retentio. Authors repeated red flag warnings: fever, foul odour, unilateral weakness, tongue biting, as reasons to abandon the uterine script for infection, apoplexy, or epilepsy. But in the run of ordinary reversible complaints, the purge logic provided an action plan households could follow. Did the plan help? For vasovagal faints, globus sensations tied to anxiety, and nocturnal panics in cold rooms, yes. Warmth, earlier meals, and regular sleep reduce episodes even by modern measures. For endocrine, cardiac, or neurological disease, the framework could mislead or delay better care. That said, medieval authors rarely relied on a single step. They layered observation with regimen and reserved stronger measures for failures, an economy of risk that explains the category's longevity. In short, calling menstruation a purge made the female cycle the central regulator in a system that prized balance and flow. Irregular cycles equaled dangerous vapours not because writers were indifferent to suffering, but because the model gave them a way to act predictably, visibly, and in concert with parish rules and household means. As long as those acts returned enough kitchens to quiet nights and steady months, the diagnosis that justified them, retentio breeding vapours and suffocatio matricis, remained the safest bet in the book. With menstruation treated as the body's built-in purge, medieval therapy for non-febrile choking, fainting and night attacks followed a standard ladder: regimen, simple remedies, procedures. When cycles were scant or delayed and the suffocatio matricis file opened, households and practitioners reached for 4 familiar tools: warming regimens, purges, cupping and bleeding, applied in that order unless red flags, fever, foul sputum, one-sided weakness, bitten tongue, forced a different diagnosis. Warming regimens, first, safest, most common. Physicians and midwives began by changing air, food, sleep and clothing, the non-naturals every student memorised. Goals: reduce cold and damp, thin, stagnant humours and promote downward flow. Room and bed: move the patient from cellars or stone floors, air the chamber by day, warm it at dusk, add wool layers, place heated bricks or salt bags at the feet, avoid lying flat on the back, favour side sleeping. Food and timing: lighter, earlier suppers, warm broths and spiced wine in winter. Avoid heavy, cold foods late at night. Baths and frictions: tepid or warm bath scented with rosemary or chamomile. Rub limbs with warmed oil, brisk frictions with wool to dry excess moisture. Odour therapy, sweet, warm below, pungent at the nose, to break an episode, mastic, myrrh, storax or rose beneath, vinegar, mustard, rue or castoreum at the nostrils. Exercise, modest walking indoors, outdoors when weather allowed, never to exhaustion. Most attacks that modern readers would link to vasovagal faint, anxiety-linked globus or winter heaviness improved here, which is why regimen anchored the syllabus from Salerno to Paris. Purges opening what was stuck before cutting. If cycles still lagged, texts moved to mild evacuatives intended to open and thin without weakening. Laxatives and electuaries, prunes, figs, manna in syrups or compound electuaries, e.g. diacatholicon, given at bedtime, observed the next morning. Cleisters, enemas, warm infusions of mallow, chamomile, linseed with a little oil and salt aimed at softening and drawing downward. Emmenagogues with caution, pennyroyal, rue, savine juniper, mugwort, myrrh, saffron, administered as drinks, baths, or pessaries, always paired with not in suspected pregnancy warnings. Apothecaries supplied measured doses, midwives watched for cramping or excess flow. The principle was to imitate nature gently, restore the monthly purge without draining strength. Cupping, direction without incision. When texts speak of drawing down, they often mean cupping, placed on the thighs, groin or lower abdomen. Dry cupping, heated cups, horn, later glass, applied to create suction, left for set counts, repeated over days. Scarified, wet cupping, light scratches under the cup to remove small amounts of blood locally, used more cautiously. Cupping produced visible marks, evidence that congestion had been relieved and could be performed by midwives or surgeons under a physician's order. Manuals warned against excessive suction, long sessions, or use in extreme debility. Bleeding last on the ladder for these cases. Phlebotomy was reserved for stubborn fullness without fever, done to redirect flow rather than to empty the whole system. Sites and timing, lower body veins, saphenous ankle to support the downward draw, timed away from heavy periods, never during profound weakness. Quantity, modest amounts guided by complexion, pulse and urine, basins were often marked for volume. Supervision, barbers or surgeons performed the cut, physicians ordered and monitored, midwives managed aftercare, warmth, broth, rest. Texts also describe alternative derivations, small leeches or tiny scarifications near the ankles in place of larger venesections, again always after regimen and purges failed. Why this stack persisted? Risk management, start reversible and cheap, escalate only if needed. The ladder protected patients from the worst harms of strong drugs or heroic cuts. Directionality, all four tools shared the same aim, warm, thin and draw downward, matching the theory that irregular menses trapped moisture and bred rising vapours. Shared labour, apothecaries mixed syrups and aromatics, midwives ran rooms, baths and cups, surgeons handled blades, physicians provided the written plan. Everyone could contribute, everyone saw action. Season and status fit, winter housing, fast seasons and celibate statuses, maidens, nuns, many widows, mapped neatly onto retention risk, so the same set of steps felt appropriate in many households. Boundaries the better authors kept. Manuals repeatedly inserted stop signs, fever or foul discharge, treat infection, not womb suffocation, sudden one-sided weakness, think apoplexy, bitten tongue and deep coma, think epilepsy. They also cautioned against overbleeding, menorrhagia and harsh purges in the frail. The rule was to restore strength first, then regulate. In sum, bleeding, cupping, purges, warming regimens were not random add-ons but a coordinated workflow, beginning with room, bed, food and odour, moving through gentle evacuatives, using cups to steer and cutting only last. The stack gave medieval households a predictable way to act when cycles stalled and vapours rose. As long as that routine returned enough kitchens to quiet nights and steadier months, the diagnosis that justified it, retentio breeding suffocatio matricis, remained the safest bet for physician, priest and midwife alike. If bleeding, cupping and mild purges were the escalations, the everyday lever was still the non-naturals: air, diet, sleep, exercise, evacuations and emotions. Medieval physicians treated daily life as dose and drug. Prescriptions did not stop at a fumigation. They continued into the pantry and the calendar. For women labelled cold and moist and prone to retentio and suffocatio, the routine began with what went on the table, how it was cooked, when it was eaten, and which season it was. Food by qualities, not calories. Diet lists in consilia and household regimens classified foods by hot, cold and dry, moist. The aim for a cold, moist patient was steady warming and slight drying without exhausting strength. Preferred roasted or baked meats, lamb kapon, firm grains, wheaten bread a day old, spices counted warming, drying, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, onions and leeks when cooked, nuts in moderation, and spiced wine or diluted wine with meals in winter. Limited or avoided raw greens and cucumbers, cold, moist, excess milk and fresh cheese, moist, heavy fish at night, cooling, large fruit plates, and late large suppers that weighed on the chest during sleep. Cooking changes the drug. Roasting dries and warms, boiling cools and moistens, pickling adds drying astringency. So a physician might approve boiled chicken for the frail in summer but order roasted in winter. Timing as therapy. Textbooks repeatedly warn against heavy evening meals. Night attacks, that incubus feeling, were traced to full stomachs and weak nocturnal heat. So the schedule became part of the cure. Larger midday dinner, lighter early supper, then a walk, then bed. Fasting seasons complicated this. Confessors could mitigate fasts for the sick. Savvy physicians wrote letters recommending earlier, modest Lenten meals for prone patients, translating medical need into acceptable penance adjustments. Temperament maps the menu. Beyond sexed complexions, individuals were marked sanguine, hot-moist, choleric, hot-dry, melancholic, cold-dry, or phlegmatic, cold-moist. The same symptoms, say a throat lump, could yield different tweaks. A phlegmatic woman got more spices, dry bread, roasted meats. A melancholic patient, cold-dry, might receive more oily, moistening foods with moderate warmth to avoid aggravating dryness, e.g. chicken with almond milk and mild spices. Physicians wrote grocery lists into consilia, not just drugs. Season decides the slope. The year itself had qualities. Winter equals cold, moist, spring, hot, moist, summer equals hot, dry, autumn, cold, dry. Regimen shifted with it. Winter, maximum warming, fires, wool, spiced broths, roasted dishes, restrict baths to warm, quick sessions, odour therapy at hand, side sleeping, heated bricks at feet. Spring, moderate warmth, introduce greens cooked with herbs, careful with sudden purges. Summer, cooling but not dampening, barley waters, lighter meats, shorter baths, avoid midday exertion, wine diluted. Autumn, guard against dryness and sudden chills, restore order after summer looseness. Because most suffocation episodes clustered in late winter and early spring, cold housing, fasts, crowded churches, these seasonal toggles were not academic. They tracked the caseload. Beverages as levers. Water could be blamed for crudities in suspicious wells. Ale and small beer counted as safer and gently warming. Wine was the adjustable dial, undiluted and spiced in winter, watered in summer, this usually with food. Physicians warned against solitary late drinking. Heat without food rises wrongly. Warm possets, milk or ale curdled with wine and spice, appear as night tonics for the weak, an example of warmth plus easy calories to head off fainting. Evacuations and rhythm. Regular stool and urine were listed like vital signs. Mild fruit and senna electuaries or warm clysters adjusted sluggish bowels on the theory that general stagnation worsened menstrual retention. The point was rhythm, predictable meals, predictable sleep, predictable evacuations. So the month did not surprise the body with a block. Exercise and air. Movement thins and moves humours, but overexertion spends heat. So the order for a cold, moist temperament was short, regular walks, indoor pacing in bad weather, gentle household work, and outdoor air in daylight to dry rooms and clothes. Physicians often wrote, "Do not sleep after dinner, walk and speak with a friend," a behavioural dose to prevent evening heaviness. Emotions as climate. The non-naturals included accidents of the soul, joy, anger, fear, sadness. Grief and anxiety were listed as cooling, sudden fright as stirring vapours. So charts paired food and room orders with social prescriptions, company for the bereaved, quieter tasks for the agitated, avoidance of quarrels, and a ban on frightening tales before bed. Priests could fold these into penance, midwives enforced them in practice. Status filters the plan. Maidens, more baths and supervised exercise, careful spice, early suppers, warm bed. Nuns, mitigated fasts, heated cells, warm drinks after night office, supervised rest. Widows, support against thin diet, structured days, walking companions, winter fuel. When money allowed, apothecaries supplied storax, mastic, myrrh. When it didn't, kitchens supplied onions, vinegar, rosemary, the same logic at different price points. Why it worked often enough. By modern lights, many target complaints, vasovagal faints, anxiety-linked globus, nocturnal panic. do respond to earlier meals, better sleep, warmth, hydration and light activity. Medieval regimen hit those levers systematically. Failures were common where disease was endocrine, cardiac, infectious or neurological, hence the better manuals, red flag lists and the stepwise escalation to procedures. In sum, daily life was the first pharmacy. Food, temperament and season let physicians write long prescriptions that households could actually carry out, with midwives as foremen and confessors as compliance officers. As long as those prescriptions bought calmer nights and steadier months, the wider diagnostic frame, retentio producing vapours, suffocatio matricis as the label, kept its place not just in books, but in kitchens and calendars. Daily life as dose and drug explains why many women felt better under routine. It also explains how very different conditions were swept under the same label. When the chart said retentio breeds vapours and vapours caused choking, fainting or disturbed sleep, anything that improved with warmth, food and earlier bedtimes looked like confirmation. In that environment, epilepsy, migraine and syncope were often filed together under the hysterical umbrella, not because physicians were indifferent, but because their tools and theory pushed them that way. Epilepsy, the difficult differential. Medieval writers did try to distinguish epilepsia from suffocation matricis. Lecture notes and concilia repeat quick rules. A bitten tongue, frothing incontinence and a deep prolonged stupor point to epilepsy. Attacks tied to menses, eased by odours and warmth, or accompanied by a throat lump point to uterine suffocation. The problem was messy reality. Not every epileptic seizure leaves classic signs. Some fits were psychogenic. Many episodes occurred at night, leaving families to reconstruct what happened. Modesty norms limited direct examination, so physicians leaned on pulse, urine and story, weak proxies for a genuine neurological diagnosis. If a woman's attacks clustered around her cycle, the default was suffocation with the standard ladder, regimen, aromatics, baths, then cupping or small bleedings. In a few cases, the red flag list, bitten tongue, prolonged coma, unilateral weakness afterwards, did kick the case out of the uterine file, but plenty of brief seizures, especially in adolescence, were treated as vapours because they responded to reduced fasting, better sleep and warmer housing. Improvement reinforced the misfile. Migraine often renamed or absorbed. Medieval medicine did have a category for migraine, hemicrania or megrim, linked to vapours rising to one side of the head, weather changes, odours or foods. Authors recommended darkness, quiet, head rubs with warming oils and regulated diet. Yet women's migraines frequently migrated on paper into suffocation for two reasons. First, periodicity. If headaches flared pre-menses or during scanty flow, the case was reinterpreted as retention-driven, not head-driven. Second, autonomic signs, nausea, light sensitivity, palpitations, fit the cold-moist story as chest disturbance from rising vapours. A sensory aura, sparkles, zigzags, blind spots, could be read as spiritual temptation by clergy or as vapours disturbing the animal spirits by physicians. Either way, the downstream plan looked like the uterine ladder more than a dedicated migraine regimen. Some writers kept hemicrania distinct and warned against bleeding the already faint. Others toggled between the two labels depending on the menstrual report. The net effect? Many migraines, especially menstrual ones, were absorbed into suffocatio matricis and treated through pelvic warmth, odour therapy and schedule control rather than as a primary head disorder. Syncope, the great confounder. If one modern diagnosis explains the persistence of the uterine file, it is syncope, short, self-limited loss of consciousness from decreased cerebral perfusion. Medieval life was full of triggers: long standing in church, hot crowded spaces, tight lacing, dehydration after fasts, anemia, grief and sudden fright. The classic vasovagal spell, warning nausea, tunnel vision, clamminess, brief collapse, quick recovery, maps almost perfectly onto the cases that proved suffocatio matricis. Open the laces, bring vinegar or mustard to the nose, warm the feet, offer wine or broth, and the patient often revived. Families saw a ritual that worked. Physicians saw a pattern that fit the chart. The label earned another victory. Orthostatic faintness, postpartum depletion, and iron deficiency likely hid behind countless entries marked vapours. Because syncope usually resolves with time plus position, stimulus, calories, the standard regimen looked authoritative, even though the mechanism had nothing to do with a womb. Why the umbrella stayed attractive? Three structural reasons kept, unlike disorders under one heading, shared triggers and seasonality. Fasts, winter cold, damp rooms, and emotional stress worsened all three conditions. A calendar fix, earlier supper, warmer bed, reduced episodes across the board, masking distinctions. Directional therapies with immediate effects. Pungent odours really do provoke deeper breaths. Warmth relaxes muscle tension. Sugar and liquids help the lightheaded. Quick wins look causal, not supportive. Institutional incentives. University medicine prized a stepwise workflow. Parishes prized discipline and order. Households wanted a plan they could afford. Suffocation coordinated all three, whereas fine-grained neurology did not exist. What got lost? And what sometimes went right? The umbrella sometimes delayed recognition of epilepsy that needed long-term precautions, or migraines that benefited from stimulus control and specific diet rather than pelvic fumigations, or syncope driven by anemia that needed iron-rich food, not bleeding. Yet the same framework often delivered harm-minimizing care. It emphasized rest after spells, warned against harsh purges in the frail, flagged fevers and unilateral weakness as stop signs, and pushed families towards safer rooms, steadier meals, and moderated fasting. In many ordinary cases, those changes were enough to lower recurrence, which in turn validated the label that had gathered the disorders together. A final caution on terms: medieval hysterical doesn't match a modern DSM category. It was a location and flow hypothesis used to sort women's non-febrile collapses and panics into a manageable routine. From our vantage, we can separate epilepsy, migraine, and syncope. From theirs, daily life was the first pharmacy, and anything tamed by warmth, food, and timing could live in one file. That practicality, more than malice, kept very different disorders marching under the same banner for centuries. Another area where the umbrella label blurred edges was the postpartum months, and the recurrent cycle-linked crises we would now recognise as PMDD-like. Medieval writers did not have endocrine language, but they watched patterns after childbirth, after weaning, before an expected period, or when a period failed to appear. If a woman developed choking episodes, night panics, faintness, or sudden weeping in those windows, and there was no fever, the file for retentio and suffocation matrices opened quickly. Postpartum, the lying-in weeks. Midwifery handbooks and Salernitan compilations treated the first 30 to 40 days after delivery as a special regimen. The mother was to be kept warm, the room aired by day, meals frequent and light, sleep protected and visitors controlled. Lochia, postpartum bleeding, was read as a necessary purge. Too little flow signalled retention, too much threatened loss of strength. Milk fever, breast engorgement, dizziness on rising, and tearfulness at night were described without modern categories. They were fitted to humoral expectations, cold, damp bodies temporarily overwhelmed by fluid shifts and loss of heat. Remedies followed the ladder already in use: rest, warmth, broth and wine in measured amounts, gentle baths and odour therapy if choking or faintness struck. Strong purges were discouraged. Authors warned that harsh evacuations could endanger a depleted patient. Grief and shock after birth. Infant death and maternal complications were common, and manuals openly linked sorrow to destabilised sleep, appetite and breath. Because the accidents of the soul were part of the non-naturals, physicians wrote grief into the plan. Companionship, quiet tasks, avoidance of fright, and a delay of fasting rules. Confessors often agreed to mitigate penances. Where episodes became spectacular, visions, accusatory voices, dangerous insomnia, the case moved toward the bishop's door. Cautious officials balanced spiritual tests with the standard medical regimen. In modern terms, some of these cases read like postpartum psychosis. In medieval files, they mix language of trial, temptation, and suffocation, with instructions that at least secured food, heat, and sleep. Sexual abstinence and calendars. Canon law required periods of postpartum abstinence, and pastoral guides multiplied days of abstinence across the year. For a patient already classed cold and moist, long abstinence was thought to raise the risk of retention. The compromise was to strengthen substitutes: more vigorous rubbing with wool, warm pelvic compresses, scheduled walks, and carefully timed baths. Physicians sometimes wrote letters to confessors asking for leniency on fasts, not on abstinence, to keep the regimen coherent without scandal. Weaning and after pains. Weaning changed appetite, sleep and bleeding patterns. Text note renewed courses after weaning, and with them, premenstrual dizziness or melancholy. If a woman reported that spells arrived predictably before flow, the diagnosis tilted toward retentio with the usual sequence: earlier suppers, room warmth, mild emmenagogues if pregnancy was excluded, pennyroyal, rue, mugwort in cautious doses, and directional fumigations, sweet below, pungent at the nose. The logic was to reopen the purge gently and prevent night episodes. PMDD-like cycles without childbirth. Many case notes describe women with clockwork distress, irritability, sleeplessness, chest tightness, and faintness in the days before menses, easing after the bleed. Medieval authors filed these under uterine causes because periodicity was their best diagnostic clue. Treatment stayed conservative. Diet altered toward warming, drying foods before the expected days, reduced late suppers, side sleeping, and having odour therapy ready. Some texts paired this with mild laxatives or warm clysters to keep general evacuation regular, on the theory that bowel stagnation worsened menstrual obstruction. Household organisation and the gossips. Midwives coordinated a support net of female neighbours who could watch nights, prepare broths and control stimuli. That last item mattered. Manuals advised against quarrels, frightening tales, and crowded church services in the volatile days around birth or bleeding. The same women helped enforce temperature and posture rules: no sleeping flat after a heavy meal, warm bricks at the feet, windows managed against damp, when the script failed. Better handbooks listed red flags that suspended the uterine model: high fever and foul lochia, think puerperal infection; unilateral weakness, think apoplexy; tongue biting or prolonged stupor, think epilepsy; chest pain with cough and sputum, think lung disease. Surgeons were called for hemorrhage. Physicians reversed from warming, drying to cooling, astringent regimens in menorrhagia. These exceptions show that the system, for all its blind spots, did have off-ramps when presentations broke pattern. Economic and status pressures. Poor households had fewer resources for fuel and food, which increased winter cases and relapse after short improvements. Widowed or unmarried mothers drew extra surveillance. Modesty rules, limited examination. Guardians and parish officers weighed in on regimen. In disputes over guardianship or fitness, a physician's letter could be used either to argue for support, she requires warmth and rest, or control, she needs stricter order. Convents, by contrast, often had infirmaries with competent routines, warm drinks after night office, heated cells in winter, supervised naps, that, in modern eyes, look like low-tech prevention, what we'd rename today. Under the medieval umbrella sat episodes we'd separate as postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, lactational amenorrhea with syncope from anemia and PMDD. The common factor was periodicity, after delivery, before bleeding, after weaning, and the quick response to heat, food, structured rest, and reduced sensory load. That response made the uterine file look right, even when the mechanism was endocrine or psychiatric rather than vapours. The lesson is procedural. Without hormones to measure or psychiatry to consult, medieval caretakers used timing, environment, and routine as their instruments. It helped many, and missed some. But the same ladder, regimen first, gentle openings next, cupping or bleeding only if necessary, red flags to exit the script, protected a good number of fragile weeks. That practical success, repeated in kitchens more than in lecture halls, is why postpartum and cycle-linked crises stayed under the hysterical umbrella so long. Cycle-linked crises were only part of the picture. Medieval caretakers repeatedly tied women's collapses, throat lumps, palpitations and sleepless nights to psychosocial shocks, bereavement, fear, humiliation, overwork, yet filed the episodes under a bodily label like retentio or suffocatio matricis. The framework allowed help without reopening social fights about blame. In practice, trauma, grief and anxiety often entered the chart as triggers that stirred vapours, in bodies already coded cold and moist and therefore unstable. Medical writers had a place for emotions in the standard list of non-naturals. Alongside air, diet, sleep, exercise and evacuations sat the accidents of the soul: joy, anger, fear and sadness. Avicennian summaries and university notes alike warned that fear cools, slows pulse, tightens chest, sadness dries, suppresses appetite, disturbs sleep, and anger heats, raises pulse, flushes face. Case histories often start with timing words: post-terrorem after a fright, post-luctum after grief, post-contumelium after public insult. But once the trigger was recorded, treatment slid back to the ladder used for uterine suffocation. Regimen first, warmth, earlier suppers, odours for acute spells, then evacuatives and directional measures if cycles faltered. Trauma arrived from many directions. Childbirth injuries, infant loss, plague burials, house fires, and market violence all show up as immediate antecedents to recurrent night panics and faintness. So did domestic coercion, beatings, forced fasting, and marital conflict, though the records soften those facts into neutral phrases about quarrels or disturbance of the household. Servants and apprentices, women in particular, appear with collapses after overwork and night vigils, then recover when a physician orders better food, earlier bedtimes, and lighter tasks. The regimen helped. The label women's disease kept the solution inside the kitchen rather than in court. Grief was treated as a physiological stressor. After a death, physicians wrote for quiet rooms, companions at night, warm drinks, and a pause in fasts. Confessors added supervised routines, attendance at mass without long-standing, specific prayer sets, bans on frightening tales at bedtime. If a patient's chest tightness and choking spells recurred in the weeks after bereavement but eased with warmth and company, the file stayed under suffocation. What we might call anxiety or panic delivered visible wins to routine and odour therapy, which in turn validated the old category. Anxiety also tracked precarity. Dowry disputes, debts, and food insecurity show up indirectly. A woman grows pale and loses sleep from care and then collapses in church during Lent. The correction, mitigated fasting, broth before services, warmer clothing, side sleeping, sounds medical. The underlying problem was economic. Municipal ordinances sometimes granted fuel or bread to the ill poor on a doctor's letter, but the diagnosis still read as a bodily imbalance. Calling it suffocation made aid orderly and temporary. Naming exploitation would have demanded different remedies. Church and medicine converged here. Pastoral manuals labelled listlessness and despair as acedia and prescribed structure. Physicians labelled the same profile, cold and moist, with retentio and prescribed structure. Both counselled recreation, walks, conversation, music at modest volume, alongside diet and sleep. Both discouraged solitary nights after shocks. Both rejected charms, steering families to approved aromatics, mastics, storax, and to house blessings instead. The result was a shared, low-conflict plan that delivered genuine comfort to many, while leaving larger causes untouched. The midwife's role is most visible in these files. She controlled the room, screened visitors, and set the tempo of evenings. For a widow with night terrors after a fire, the midwife's checklist: air the chamber by day, warm it by dusk, light supper, warm bricks at the feet, rosemary in the brazier, side sleeping, someone to sit the first half of the night, often reduced episodes. Physicians then wrote the same steps into Latin, tying them to humours and cycles. Credit followed the paperwork. University texts were not blind to misclassification. Better authors repeated red flag lists: fever and foul sputum, infection, bitten tongue, and deep stupor, epilepsy, one-sided weakness, apoplexy. They also admitted melancholy, black bile disturbance, as a separate path where grief hardened into fixed sadness, advising light, warming diets and guarded use of purges. Still, in women of childbearing age, especially maidens, nuns and widows, episodic distress without fever gravitated back to suffocation because that category came with socially acceptable steps and clear lines of authority. Why label psychosocial pain a women's disease? 3 structural reasons made the shortcut durable. First, the gendered body model. Women were charted as colder and moister, hence prone to stagnation, hence susceptible to vapours when shocked or saddened. Second, risk management. The uterine workflow was safe, cheap and teachable. It solved many cases of syncope and panic, even when the real cause was loss or fear. Third, governance. Towns preferred remedies that kept peace. Regularised meals, moderated fasting, supervised nights over remedies that questioned husbands, masters or wages. Medicalising distress spared argument while still doing something. From a modern vantage, many files read like post-traumatic reactions, generalised anxiety, depressive episodes or anemia-linked faintness. Medieval caretakers lacked those categories, but not procedural sense. They built a surround, heat, food, sleep, company, lighter duties, that genuinely lowers symptom frequency for many stressed bodies. The cost was conceptual. Pain rooted in violence, scarcity, or grief was absorbed into a uterus and vapors story. That story endured because it worked often enough, kept disorder low, and fit the books already on the lectern. By the later Middle Ages, the way towns organised medical work made women's disease labels hard to dislodge. Diagnosis and higher status treatment were tied to institutions, universities and urban guilds, that largely excluded women from full membership. The result was predictable. Women could do care, but they struggled to define it. Guild rules and civic bans locked that asymmetry in place. Urban healthcare split into recognised arts. Physicians, university men, held the licence to explain causes and write regimens. Surgeons and barber surgeons belonged to craft guilds and performed procedures, suturing, bleeding, cupping, dental pulls. Apothecaries compounded drugs under statutes that policed weights, freshness, and recipes. Midwives were indispensable, but sat outside the honorific ladder, sworn before councils or bishops, paid fees or stipends, and bound by oaths, but not organised as a powerful guild with apprentices and a path to master status. Guild structures mattered because they controlled entry. To open a surgery shop or an apothecary, a practitioner usually needed 1. Apprenticeship under a master, 2. Freemanship, citizenship in the town, and 3. A master's test or inspection. Women rarely met those tests, not because they lacked skill, but because the pipeline was male by design. Apprenticeship contracts, guild halls, and drinking funds were male spaces. Statutes often barred women from taking apprentices or sitting examinations. Widows were the exception that proved the rule. Many towns let a widow continue her late husband's shop by right of widowhood, sometimes until a son came of age, but she generally could not create new masters or expand the business. Status was derivative, not independent. Add the universities, and the wall got higher. City ordinances in places like Paris or Montpellier deferred to the faculty of medicine for who could call himself physician. Women were shut out at step 1 because universities did not admit them. When councils wrote that surgeons must not bleed without a physician's order, or apothecaries must not dispense compound drugs without a physician's recipe, they indirectly channeled authority to a class that women could not join. Enforcement was real. Guild wardens and civic officers fined unlicensed healers, confiscated stock, and sometimes banished repeat offenders. The paperwork shows it. In 1322 Paris, a woman known as Jacoba Felici, often cited by historians, was prosecuted for practicing as a physician without license. Witnesses even praised her cures, but the court upheld the faculty's monopoly and forbade her practice. Similar actions appear in German and Italian towns. Women labelled empirics could sell simples or offer nursing, but stepping into diagnosis or surgery drew penalties. The line was clear, care was tolerated, causes were reserved. Midwives illustrate the mixed position. Many cities required an oath: assist rich and poor, keep secrets, avoid charms, baptize in emergency, call a priest or physician when danger rose. Councils set fees and sometimes supplied instruments. Yet midwives lacked the guild muscle of surgeons or apothecaries. They could not usually take formal apprentices, lobby for shop privileges, or issue public opinions. When a tricky case, fainting, choking, night terrors, went up the chain, the midwife's practical notes were filtered through a physician's Latin regimen that returned the old explanation: retentio and suffocatio matrices. The woman who steadied the patient did not set the label in the record. Apothecary statutes also narrowed space for women's authority. In many towns, apothecaries belonged to the Spices' Grocers Guild. Wives and widows worked in shops, kept accounts, and compounded simples. But statutes required that compound medicines be prepared to a physician's prescription and subject to guild inspection. If a woman ran a shop as a widow, she was often required to hire a licensed male assistant to satisfy inspectors. Again, the hands might be female. The signature was not. Why does this matter for the persistence of hysteria-type diagnoses? Because guild and university rules rewarded standardization. A licensed physician earned credibility by following the accepted ladder: regimen, odours, evacuatives, cupping, bleeding, and only then exceptions. Divergence risked censure from colleagues or councils. Female practitioners, midwives and wise women, could stabilise patients with warmth, timing and observation, but their explanations did not become teachable doctrine. Over time, the teachable beat the doable in the archive. Markets reinforced the pattern. Each guild had an income stream attached to its scope. Physicians billed for consilia and house calls, surgeons for procedures, apothecaries for ingredients, midwives for attendance. A diagnosis like suffocatio matricis coordinated everyone without threatening anyone's charter. It authorised apothecaries to sell aromatics, surgeons to cup when ordered, midwives to manage heat and posture, and physicians to write the plan. A different framing, trauma, exploitation, grief, would have pointed outside the licensed marketplace to employers, courts, or husbands. Guild rules kept the solution inside. None of this means women were absent from skilled care. Records show female barbers, bathhouse workers, bone setters, and the occasional surgeon, usually as widows or in family shops. But the path to status, the right to define, license, and teach, ran through institutions built to exclude them. That is why the same women who made episodes stop rarely got to rename what those episodes were. The law and the guilds fixed the vocabulary. Women's non-febrile collapses belonged to the womb, to vapours, to suffocation. In a system that policed who could speak with authority, the label endured not just because it sometimes helped, but because the people empowered to say what counted were trained to say exactly that. Guilds and universities didn't just police who could speak, they also shaped how care was sold. In that marketplace, simple, portable labels like suffocatio matricis had clear advantages. They shortened debates, fit existing fee schedules, and turned ambiguous symptoms into predictable work for everyone in the chain: physician, surgeon, barber, apothecary, and midwife. Predictability equals billability. Urban ordinances and faculty statutes often tied fees recognisable services. An examination, a house call, a written concilium, a procedure, a compound. A catch-all label let the physician move quickly from "what is it" to "here is the standard plan," which meant a chargeable visit now and a copyable regimen later. Long, speculative differentials risked unpaid time. A short exam, pulse, urine, brief history, a familiar diagnosis, retentio suffocatio, and a ladder of steps gave households a quote practitioners a timetable. The inventory matched the diagnosis. Apothecaries carried resins and aromatics, mastic, storax, myrrh, warming oils, senna syrups, and the ingredients for pessaries. Surgeons and barbers stood ready with cups and lancets. Midwives managed rooms, baths, and posture. A label that prescribed what the city already stocked created smooth demand. No rare drugs, no bespoke instruments, just items with known margins and turnover. Seasonality, winter cold, Lenten fasts, even produced predictable spikes in sales of warming simples and syrups. Speed reassured payers. Households wanted action during a faint or night attack. The suffocation script delivered visible steps within minutes. Loosen laces, warm the feet, sweet aromatics below, pungent at the nose. Each move signalled competence and justified the immediate fee. If the patient revived, the success was attributed to the protocol. If not, the same script authorised the next paid step, a visit to the apothecary, cupping, or a physician's return call. Standardisation protected reputations. University medicine rewarded adherence to authorities. Avicenna, Salerno commentaries. Writing suffocatio matricis in the case note and following the regimen Simple's procedures ladder produced a record that was defensible before guild wardens, councils, and necessary courts. If a case ended badly, the physician could show conformity to recognised method and red-flagged cautions: no fever, no foul sputum, no one-sided weakness. A novel theory with a poor outcome invited censure. A standard label with a standard plan did not. Teaching and scaling. Catch-all diagnoses were teachable. Students memorised triggers, retained menses, cold damp, signs, slow, small pulse, pale urine, cyclical timing, and the order of operations. As these men dispersed to other towns, the same label travelled with them, bringing brand consistency that guilds liked and households learned to expect. Copyable concilia circulated. A single good outcome could be recopied as precedent across regions, multiplying the label's reach without new evidence. Low conflict, steady custom. Many collapses and night panics were rooted in grief, overwork, thin diet, or crowded housing. Naming those causes risked disputes with husbands, employers, or landlords, people who also paid fees and taxes. Suffocatio kept solutions inside the medical marketplace: fuel, food guidance, aromatics, supervised rest, occasional procedures. Everyone paid someone. Nobody argued law or wages. For councils tasked with public order, that was a feature, not a bug. Pricing ladders for every purse, the same diagnosis scaled from poor to rich. A village household could manage with vinegar, onions, wool frictions, and a midwife's supervision. A merchant house could buy storax, musk, custom pessaries, and multiple visits. The therapeutic logic stayed intact, while the basket price rose or fell, making Suffocation a rare product that fit all market segments. Procedures with proof. Cupping and small bleedings were easy for surgeons to price and display. Cupping left marks, basins recorded blood volumes. Those visible results proved that congestion had been relieved, supporting the physician's written cause and the surgeon's bill. When procedures were ordered only after regimen and simples, they looked judicious rather than predatory. Paperwork created memory and marketing. Physicians' letters and casebooks documented recoveries as victories for the method. Hagiographies did the same for saints, but in civic files and guild disputes, the medical paperwork carried weight. Over time, survivorship bias set in. Successful, ordinary cases using a catch-all were copied and taught. Failures that broke pattern were diverted. Infection, apoplexy, epilepsy, and didn't count against the label. Clerical compatibility lowered friction costs. Because the regimen overlapped with penance advice, earlier suppers, moderated fasting, quiet nights, parish clergy could endorse the plan without ceding authority. Joint endorsement reduced transaction costs. Fewer jurisdictional fights, faster approvals, smoother payments. A diagnosis that clergy could live with and guilds could police sold better than one that invited turf wars. Risk and refund logic. A safe, stepwise plan minimised harm in the common reversible cases, vasovagal syncope, anxiety-linked globus. When improvement followed, households renewed custom. When it didn't, the physician could pivot to a different file, melancholy, lung disease, without admitting error, because the initial choice matched the book. Low downside, some quick wins equals repeat business. Put bluntly, catch-all diagnoses were market products tailored to medieval institutions, standardized, defensible, scalable, and compatible with existing inventories and moral calendars. They didn't sell because they were flawless. They sold because they fit the guild rules, the university syllabus, parish expectations, and the household budget. In a system built to reward speed, order, and paperwork, a label that converted many complaints into one workflow was the rational choice, for the ledger as much as for the patient. And that's our little journey for tonight. We followed a single label across kitchens, guild halls, parishes, and lecture rooms, and watched how it shaped real lives. If nothing else, I hope you leave with a clearer map. Who got to define illness, why the same symptoms wore different names, and how everyday things, food, warmth, sleep, seasons, did most of the heavy lifting. History isn't just big battles. It's the small routines people use to steady a shaky world. Before you head out, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What surprised you most? Which part felt closest to today? If you want more slow, human-sized history like this, please subscribe. It keeps this cozy corner going and helps me plan the next series. If you're already subscribed, thank you for being here. You're the reason these long evenings are worth it. Let's do a tiny check-in before we close. What snack kept you company tonight, and where are you watching from? Tea and toast in the kitchen? Hot chocolate on the couch? Tap it in. I read every note and love seeing our little map of listeners light up. Okay, lights low, tabs closed, shoulders down. Thanks for spending your time and attention here. Sleep well, stay warm, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Good night.